The wolf skeleton leaped right at him, and Dan did the only thing he'd learned in 20 years in the kitchen. He grabbed the first thing within reach and hurled it. It happened to be a 5-kilogram bag of flour. And that's how a chef from New York saved the hero squad from certain death. But let's go back 5 minutes. The first thing he sensed was a smell. Wet earth, mint, and something metallic, as if someone had spilled blood on the grass and left it to dry in the sun. Dan Reed opens his eyes and sees the sky. Too blue, too clear. You don't see a sky like that in New York. You don't see a sky like that anywhere. He's lying on the shoulder of a dirt road. His back is wet with dew. His arms are intact. His legs are intact. His head is buzzing, but still working. The last thing he remembers is the headlights of a truck and a vague thought about his mom's sauce. And now he's lying in the grass, smelling mint and iron. Someone is shouting nearby. Dan turns his head. 20 paces away, a wagon has overturned. The horse is thrashing in its harness. 6 armored men stand with their backs to one another. Shadows dart around them, short, fast, with bony ridges along their spines and empty eye sockets instead of eyes. Wolves, only not alive. Skeletons covered in dry skin. They twitch in jerks like marionettes on strings. One warrior falls. A creature leaps onto his chest. A girl with a bow takes aim, but 2 others come at her from the left. Dan doesn't think. 20 years in the kitchen have drilled one thing into him. When everything goes to hell, you don't just stand there. You grab the first thing within reach and get to work. He jumps up. A cart is nearby. Sacks. He reaches into the nearest one and scoops out a handful of white powder. Flour. A 5-kilogram sack lies in the overturned cart like a gift from fate. Dan grabs it with both hands and hurls it into the face of the nearest creature. The sack bursts open. A white cloud completely engulfs the skeletal wolf. The creature screeches. It whimpers. It rubs its empty eye sockets with its paws. The flour clogs its mouth and nostrils. Meanwhile, Dan is already yelling at the girl with the bow that there's a gap on her left and she needs to move over. She looks at him like he's crazy, but she moves over. 2 arrows fly toward the left flank. Both hit their mark. A guy in golden armor, wielding a sword the size of an oar, slices the blinded creature in half. The rest finish off the last few. Silence falls on the road like a wet towel. Dan stands in the midst of the settling dust. He's all pale, his hands are shaking, his knees are trembling, but his face is calm. He looked exactly the same during Saturday rush hour in the kitchen. The golden-haired one approaches first. Young, about 24, broad shoulders, an open, honest face, the kind you trust right away, and then trust him. He shakes Dan's hand and says that Dan is dressed strangely and speaks strangely, but thinks on his feet, and he asks if Dan will come with them. They need a cook. The last one ran off a week ago. Dan looks at his hands, flour under his fingernails, a scrape from the sack on his palm. It's all real, not a dream, or a very convincing dream. He shakes the man's hand in return and says he'll go. If this is a dream, he'll see it through to the end. If not, then at least he'll feed someone properly. The golden-haired man's name is Alan Brightheim, a paladin. The rest introduce themselves briefly. Sedric Vale, mage, a lanky, tall guy with the face of a perpetually dissatisfied man. Gareth Stone, shield-bearer. He's stocky. He says nothing. Hands like a butcher's. Fenris Blackwood, spearman, a red-haired, nervous man twirling his spear between his fingers. Lira Morgan, priestess, a gentle face, tired eyes, hands bandaged from constant healing. And a girl with a bow, Yerin Cho. She doesn't introduce herself. She just nods, lips pursed, eyes serious. And Dan notices how she rubs the fingers of her right hand, a subtle movement, a habit. Someone who does this constantly doesn't even notice it themselves anymore. But Dan always notices things like that. At the restaurant, he saw that the guest at the third table had swollen legs, that the woman by the window wasn't eating bread not because she didn't want to, but because it hurt to chew, that the bartender had a drink because his hands shook in the mornings. Yerin's fingers, numbness, Maybe a nerve, maybe an old injury. He takes note and goes to look at the wagon. It belonged to a merchant who was hauling supplies for the detachment. The merchant fled during the first attack. The horse was left behind. The supplies were left behind. Dan opens the crates. Coarsely ground flour, gray with impurities. The oil in the clay jug smells like goat. Not milk, goat. The salted meat is so oversalted it could be used to pave a road. Some kind of limp root vegetables, like turnips. The brown groats smell like dust. Only the bundle of dried herbs looks decent. Dan stands over this wealth and sighs. For 20 years, he'd worked with the best New York had to offer. Japanese Wagyu at $400 a kilo. Truffles from Alba. Butter from Normandy. Saffron from Iran. And now he has rancid goat butter and grains that smell like an attic. Fine, he's seen worse. Once at Komorebi, the fridge broke down and he had to feed 30 people with whatever he could find in the pantry. All 30 left satisfied. He rolls up his sleeves. The first stop by the stream is in 2 hours. Dan asks for 20 minutes and a campfire. Gareth silently builds the fire. Dan hangs up the pot. He slices the salted meat into thin strips and soaks them in the stream. Half the salt washes away. Brown groats go into the boiling water. Next come the root vegetables, diced into small cubes. He rubs the herbs between his palms and tosses them in at the last minute. He renders the goat fat separately on a flat stone. When the fat stops smelling like goat, he adds it to the pot. A simple stew, nothing special. But the ingredients are cut evenly. The cooking time is just right. Herbs at the end, not at the beginning. The fat is purified. Every step is right. Dan divides the soup into 6 equal portions. He doesn't yet know who he's cooking for. He doesn't know their bodies. He doesn't know their stories. So he simply cooks honest food. Alan is the first to taste it. He freezes. He looks at Dan. He finishes in silence and asks for seconds. Gareth silently gives a thumbs up. Fenris says it's the best porridge he's had in 3 months. Lira eats slowly, her eyes closed. Sedric says nothing, but he scrapes the bowl clean. Yerin eats in silence. She holds the bowl with both hands, and Dan notices. She's warming her palms against the hot clay. Her fingers. Definitely her fingers. The next morning, he gets up before everyone else. Darkness. Dew. The embers are still warm. He stokes the fire and gets things ready. By the time Alan wakes up, the camp smells of something hot and alive. Breakfast is ready before the sun rises. No one asked him to. No one set a time. Dan just got up and did it. This is how his first day in the Heroes Squad begins. He doesn't yet know that the world is called Ehrenfeld. He doesn't know that magic here works through resonance. He doesn't know that the squad is going to kill a demon king named Valgrim. He doesn't know that the sky is blue because the resonance background of the is different from that on Earth. He knows one thing. The girl with the bow's fingers are freezing. And tomorrow morning, he'll make her some broth. On the 3rd day, Dan began to realize what he'd gotten himself into. A squad of heroes. 6 chosen by the Council of the 5 Kingdoms. The mission? Reach the Black Citadel. Kill the Demon King Valgrim. The deadline is 2 years. Failure means the end of the world. Alan told this story that evening by the campfire, simply and without fanfare, just as one would explain a plan for the next shift. Dan listened and thought that if this was a dream, he had a very vivid imagination. And if it wasn't a dream, then he was stuck in a world where the end of the world was on schedule, and he was the only person without a weapon. He washed his mess kit and thought about his mom, about how she was waiting for him on Sunday, about the sauce he never got around to bringing. Then he closed his eyes, opened them. The sky was still too blue. So it wasn't a dream. Fine. He went back to washing the mess kit. On the morning of the 4th day, Yerin sat by the extinguished campfire and stretched her right hand. She bent her fingers, straightened them, bent them again. Her expression didn't change. She did it as if it were a routine, like someone who had long since grown accustomed to pain and no longer considered it a problem. Dan walked over to her and asked how long her fingers had been numb. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wary. She replied that it was none of his business. Dan nodded. He walked over to the wagon. He went through the supplies. Yesterday, during a rest stop, he'd spotted some wild ginger in a ditch by the road. The root was thin and tough, but alive. He'd cut it off with his paring knife. At a shop they'd passed 2 days ago, he'd bought a small bottle of oily liquid for 3 copper coins. The merchant had said it was an extract from the seeds of some plant. No one was buying it because it smelled strange. Dan popped the cork and inhaled the scent. Sesame. Sesame oil. Or rather, something so similar to sesame oil that the difference didn't matter. He almost laughed. Sesame oil in a world of bone wolves. He also had bones. Yesterday's piece of salted meat had been on the bone. He'd trimmed off the meat but kept the bone. He'd washed it and charred it over the coals. On the 5th day of their journey, they stopped earlier than usual. Rain. Fenris stretched out a canopy made of oiled cloth. Everyone sat down beneath it, wet, cold, irritated. Sedric was drying his cloak with a spell and grumbling that they were wasting time. Dan lit a fire under the canopy. He hung up the pot. Water. The bone went in first. A slow fire. Very slow. He wasn't in a hurry. In Komorebi, the broth had simmered for 12 hours. Here, he had an hour and a half. But the bone was singed just right. The water was clear. The fire was steady. An hour later, he pulled out the bone. The broth was clear, golden, with a thin film of fat on the surface. Ginger, thin slices, into the broth. Garlic. He'd found some wild garlic at the edge of the forest that morning. He crushed them with the flat side of his knife and added them to the broth. Mushrooms. The day before, they'd been walking through the undergrowth, and Dan had spotted some mushrooms on a fallen tree. He gathered a handful. He sniffed them. The texture was firm, an earthy smell with a hint of something nutty, not poisonous. He knew this by the same instinct that had allowed him to tell fresh fish from day-old fish back in New York. The mushrooms went into the broth 10 minutes before it was done. Fermentation didn't work out. Time was short, but he found a solution. He crushed 3 mushrooms in a mortar into a paste. He left it on a rock by the fire for 40 minutes. Not fermentation, but the start of the process. The mushroom paste went into the broth last. A few drops of sesame oil on top. He poured 1 bowl, not 6, just 1. He walked over to Yerin, set it in front of her, told her to drink slowly in small sips and to hold the bowl in her hands and not set it down. Yerin looked at him. Then at the bowl. Steam rose from it. The aroma was rich and warm. She cupped the bowl with both hands. The first sip. Second. Third. The warmth spread from her throat downward, into her chest, her arms, her fingers. She drank slowly, just as he'd said. She didn't set the bowl down. The warmth from the clay warmed her palms from the outside, while the broth warmed her from the inside. 10 minutes later, she felt a tingling in her fingertips. Not pain, but something else. As if the blood that had bypassed those areas for years had suddenly remembered the way. 20 minutes later, she bent her fingers, straightened them, bent them again, quickly, easily, without the usual stiffness. She looked at Dan with wide eyes. She asked what he had done to her. Dan shrugged. He said he'd just warmed her from the inside. The blood had started flowing and the numbness had gone from her fingers. He really did think so. Yerin looked at her hands. Her fingers moved freely. For the first time in 3 years. She didn't say thank you. She just gripped the bowl tighter and drank it down to the last drop. Dan went back to the pot and began serving the others. Just plain stew. Not broth. He'd cooked the stew from whatever was left over. He prepared the same thing for everyone else because he didn't know them yet. He hadn't seen them. He hadn't taken the time to get to know them. It takes time to understand a person through their body. He understood Yerin because he'd been watching her hands for 3 days. Sedric finished his stew and noticed that the cook was taking too long for a simple porridge. 2 hours for lunch is a luxury on a hike. Dan didn't say anything. In the kitchen, he never argued with people who didn't understand the difference between food and fuel. The days passed. Dan was a quick learner. The world of Yerin operated by rules he didn't understand but accepted. Magic exists. Monsters exist. Adventurer ranks from F to SSS exist. Guilds. Kingdoms. Seals restraining the Demon King. All of this was real. He listened to the conversations by the campfire and memorized them. Alan talked about the Council of the Five Kingdoms. Sedric debated theories of magical schools. Lira prayed before bed and explained to Fenris that the gods' blessings aren't infinite. Dan took it all in stride, and he cooked. Every morning, every evening. No days off, no requests. He simply did what he'd done his whole life. He got up before everyone else. He went to bed after everyone else. In between, he fed the 6 of them. By the end of the 2nd week, he knew each of them through their food. Alan ate quickly and in large quantities. He had a young body. He burned twice as much energy as he realized. He needs slow-release carbs and fatty protein. Dan started making his porridge thicker and adding rendered fat. Gareth ate little but hearty food. His body was like a fortress. Lots of muscle mass, little flexibility. His joints creak. He needs collagen. Broth. Lots of broth. Cartilage. Tendons. Anything that simmers for a long time. Fenris ate nervously. He bit into his food and chewed quickly. His stomach is weak. His acidity is high. He needs soft food. Porridge. Stewed dishes. No fried foods. Lira barely ate. She gets tired easily. Healing drains her strength. She needs something sweet. Quick energy. Dan found wild honey in a tree hollow. He started adding it to her morning porridge. Sedric ate steadily, without emotion. But Dan noticed that after his meal, the mage would close his eyes for a second. Just 1 second, and his face would relax. So the taste was getting through. It's just that Sedric isn't the type to show it. And every morning, Yerin received her broth. Without words, without explanations. Dan cooked it while everyone was asleep. By the time she woke up, the bowl was sitting on a rock by the fire, covered with a rag. Hot. Every day. She never once said thank you, but every day she drank it all down to the last drop. The squad was heading east, toward the Pass of the Wailing Winds, the first serious milestone on the way to the Black Citadel. Ahead lay mountains, cold, and beasts larger than bone wolves. Dan didn't think much about that. He thought about how the flour was running out, that there was only 3 days' worth of salted meat left, that he needed to find a decent source of protein, or in a week the party would be chewing on roots. These were sensible thoughts, familiar ones, the thoughts of a cook, not a hero, and they kept him afloat better than any sword. By the 6th week of the journey, the party had stopped losing. Not that they'd been losing before, but before, after every battle, someone would be limping. Someone would be clutching their ribs. Lira would expend her last reserves of strength on healing and fall asleep on the move. Now everything had changed. Gareth moved faster. His shield, which had once seemed too heavy even for his arms, had become an extension of his body. His joints had stopped creaking. Fenris had stopped missing his strikes in close combat. His hands no longer trembled from the acid in his stomach. Lira spent half as much energy on healing because the wounds were healing faster on their own. Alan struck harder. His body, which had been burning energy like a furnace, was finally getting the right amount of fuel of the right quality. Even Sedric. His spells had become more precise. Formulas that used to trail off on the 3rd syllable now rang out like a gunshot. He didn't attribute it to the food. He thought he'd simply rested, or that the mountain air was cleaner, or that his training had finally paid off. None of them linked it to Dan. He's just a cook. He just cooks soup and broth. He just gets up at 4 in the morning and goes to bed at midnight. He just goes into the forest for half an hour every evening and comes back with herbs, roots, and mushrooms that no one has ever heard of. Every serving is just a little bit different from the next. Yerin noticed. She was the only one who noticed, because she was the only one who kept an eye on him. Not because she was curious, but because every morning she woke up and her fingers were already moving. For 3 years, she'd woken up with numb hands. For 3 years, the first 10 minutes of every day were devoted to stretching. Now she'd wake up and her fingers were already moving, and a bowl of broth stood nearby. She began to count. Her broth always had ginger in it. Alan's broth was always thicker. Fenris's porridge was always softer. There was always something sweet in Lyra's food. Gareth gets all the gristle and stringy pieces of meat that the others would consider scraps. Sedric gets the same as everyone else, but in his portion, Yerin once noticed a dark speck that wasn't in the others. Dan cooked 6 different dishes from a single pot, every day, and no one but her saw it. In the 8th week, they crossed the pass of the moaning winds. The altitude, the cold, the air was as thin as paper. Fenris was gasping for breath. Lyra turned pale. Even Alan was walking more slowly. That evening, Dan prepared a thick stew from everything he had: root vegetables, dried meat, fat, honey, and mountain herbs he'd gathered on the ascent. He cooked it for 3 hours. The party ate in silence. In the morning, everyone felt as if they'd slept on a feather bed in a warm house, rather than on rocks in the mountains at an altitude of 3,000 steps. Sedric said it was a blessing from the mountain spirits. Dan said nothing. After the pass, the trail led downhill. The forests grew denser. The wildlife was dangerous. In the 10th week, they encountered a squad of demonic guards. 7 creatures in black armor, a head taller than a man. Their eyes were red. Their movements were swift and precise. Not like the bone wolves, these ones could think. The battle lasted 20 minutes. Alan struck first. Gareth held the right flank. Fenris struck at the gaps in the armor. Yerin fired from a tree. Sedric burned them with spells. Lira healed Fenris, whose shoulder had been pierced. Dan stood behind the cart. He's not a fighter. He doesn't get involved in the battle. He's holding a vegetable knife and realizes that this knife won't help against a creature in black armor. But he watches. He's counting. After the 4th blow, Alan began to slow down. That means his stamina isn't infinite, and his energy expenditure is higher than Dan thought. Fenris missed a blow because his right shoulder is weaker than his left, an old injury he doesn't talk about. After his 3rd spell, Sedric rubbed his temple. A headache. Overload. After healing Fenris, Lira turned pale, almost blue. She needs more. More sweets. More calories. More of everything. Yerin's shots were flawless. Not a single miss. Her fingers moved perfectly. Dan allowed himself a moment of pride in his broth. After the battle, he silently began to cook. No one had asked him to. He simply lit a fire and set the pot on it. An hour later, each of the 6 received their portion. Alan got thick meat porridge with fat and carbs. Gareth got broth made from cartilage. Fenris got a soft, warm soup with honey to help his shoulder heal. Lyra got a double portion with honey and dried berries that Dan had been gathering for 3 days. Sedric got a regular portion, but with those same dark specks. Yerin had her broth. The squad ate in silence, because after a battle, there are no words. There is only exhaustion and warmth in the stomach, and gratitude that needs no expression. Dan washed his pot and thought about how he needed to find a new source of ginger. Their supplies were running out, and without ginger, the broth for Yerin would lose half its effectiveness. In the 11th week, Dan found something strange. They were passing through the trading town of Crestvale, the market square. Dozens of stalls. Dan walked past them all. Flour, poor quality. Butter, goat's milk. Meat, passable. Fish, yesterday's. He moved along the stalls, his face expressing that particular kind of professional anguish that only a cook in a poor market can understand. In the very corner of the square, he found an old woman's stall. Small, inconspicuous. On the counter were pots filled with something loose. Herbs, roots, spices. Dan approached. He took a pinch of something white substance from the open pot. He rubbed it between his fingers, brought it to his nose. Salt, but not ordinary salt. The crystals were large, slightly bluish. The scent was clean, almost sweet. The taste. He placed a crystal on his tongue. Salty, but with an aftertaste. Long-lasting, mellow. As if still remembered the sea from which it had come. He asked the old woman what it was. She said it was sea salt from the northern coast, nothing special. Dan bought the whole jar, 6 silver coins, half his monthly pay in the detachment. Sedric saw the purchase and said the cook had lost his mind. 6 silver coins for salt. Dan didn't reply. That evening, he prepared the same broth, the same ingredients, the same heat. But instead of the usual gray salt, he added 3 crystals of the new kind. The broth changed. Not in taste, the taste became purer, deeper. But something else had changed, something Dan couldn't explain. When Alan drank his portion, he froze for a second. He looked at his hands, clenched his fist, unclenched it, and said quietly that he felt as if he'd just received a blessing in a temple. Dan looked at the salt, at the broth, at Alan. And for the first time, he thought that in this world, something wasn't working the way he was used to. The squad had grown significantly stronger thanks to Dan's personalized meals, but no one except Yerin linked this to the cook. Dan began to study each fighter's weaknesses in detail by observing them in battle. In the trading city of Crestvale, he found an unusual salt that enhanced the effect of his cooking, and for the first time, he suspected that food in this world worked differently. By the second week, everything fell apart. They were traveling through the Gorge of Silence. It was narrow, with stone walls 100 paces high. Shadows lay so thick on the gorge's floor that the torches didn't dispel them but only made them denser. Sedric said the place was saturated with residual demonic energy. Alan ordered them to move quickly and without stopping. They didn't make it in time. An ambush. Creatures rained down from the walls above. Not demonic guards, worse. Shadowhounds. Shapeless, fluid, like inkblots with teeth. They didn't run, they trickled down the walls. Silently. Alan slashed at them, but his sword passed right through them. Sedric burned them with fire, and the creatures retreated but didn't die. They reformed within seconds. Gareth shielded Lira and Fenris with his shield. 3 hounds hung on the shield. He stood. He held his ground. But his knees were buckling. Yerin shot arrows. The arrows passed right through them. It was useless. She switched from regular arrows to consecrated ones. Lira had blessed them before the battle. The consecrated arrows worked. But there were only 4 of them. 4 arrows against 12 creatures. Yerin hit her mark 4 times. 4 hounds crumbled to dust. 8 remained. Lira stepped forward. She raised her hands. A white light. Healing magic turned inside out. Against the undead, healing works as a weapon. 3 hounds were incinerated. Lira fell to her knees, blood from her nose. Exhaustion. 5 remained. Dan stood behind the wagon, as always, a paring knife in his hand. Useless. He saw Alan slowing down, how Gareth dropped to one knee, how Fenris held his spear in his left hand because his right shoulder had given out, how Sedric clutched his head after every spell. They held out, barely. Alan finished off the last hound with pure paladin light. He fell. He lay there for 5 minutes without moving. Dan was already cooking. He'd built a fire right in the gorge. To hell with the demonic energy. He didn't care that the walls were closing in. People were wounded. People were tired. People were hungry. He cooked. They ate. And an hour later, they were able to move on. But something had changed. Sedric was silent all evening. He kept looking at Dan. In the morning, he went up to Alan and talked to him for 20 minutes. Dan didn't hear the words, but he saw their faces. Sedric spoke harshly. Alan listened and turned pale. After the conversation, Alan called Dan over. They walked away from the camp. Alan stood there, unable to begin. He rubbed the back of his head. He stared at the ground. Finally, he spoke. Sedric had set a condition. Either the cook leaves the squad or he leaves. Dan remained silent. Alan explained. Sedric believes that Dan is taking up a fighter's spot, that the squad is wasting resources on someone without combat skills, that they barely survived the Gorge of Silence, and one useless member is a luxury they can't afford. Dan remained silent. Alan said he understood, that he appreciated everything Dan had done. But Sedric is a 4th-rank archmage. His spells decide the outcome of battles. Without him, the squad won't make it to the Citadel. Without the cook, they will. Dan remained silent. Alan handed him a leather pouch. Silver. He said it wasn't his decision. He wished him luck. His voice was hoarse. His eyes were wet. The guy was 24 years old, and he just had to choose between a mage and a cook. He'd made the right choice by the logic of war, and the wrong one as a human being, and he knew it. Dan took the purse, silently. He didn't argue, he didn't beg, he didn't explain. He'd learned this lesson long ago in the kitchen. If the chef tells you to leave, you leave. Not because the chef is right, but because arguing in the kitchen during service kills everyone. He returned to camp, packed his things, a mess kit, a knife, a bag with the remains of his supplies, a jar of unusual salt, his notes which he'd jotted down on scraps of parchment. Yerin stood to the side and watched, her lips pressed together until they were white, her hands at her sides. She didn't say a word. Dan approached her last. He pulled a rag out of the bag. Wrapped inside were a ginger root and a small clay jar of mushroom paste. He said she needed to steep the ginger in hot water every morning, a pinch of the paste in boiling water. Drink it slowly. Hold it in her hands. She took the rag. Her fingers trembled, but not from the cold. Dan turned and set off down the road. Alone, unarmed, without a horse. With a pot and a sack of flour slung over his shoulders. He didn't look back. 6 pairs of eyes were watching the back of his head. 5 of them felt awkward. 1 pair was wet. Sedric wasn't looking. He was sitting by the fire, reading a book of spells. Dan was walking west along the road. The squad was heading east. The distance between them grew with every step. Dan wondered where to go. He had enough silver to last a month if he was frugal. Enough food for a week. 0 combat skills. Minimal knowledge of the world. He was walking along a road in a medieval fantasy world, without weapons, without magic, and without a plan. He had a mess kit, a vegetable peeler, and 20 years of experience in the kitchen. He walked for 2 days. He spent the nights under the trees. He ate whatever he could find, roots, wild herbs, and water from streams. On the 3rd day, he came to a fork in the road, a milestone with signposts. To the left, Crossvale. To the right, Willowbrook. He knew Crossvale, a trading town, large, lots of people, competition. He didn't know Willowbrook. The name sounded quiet, rustic. He turned right. Willowbrook turned out to be exactly what it sounded like. A small settlement at the crossroads of 2 trade routes. 13 houses. A blacksmith shop. A general store. A tavern. A temple. A mill on the hill. Fields all around. A forest beyond the fields. A river running through the settlement. A quiet place. A forgotten place. A place where you can cook soup and no one will come to tell you that you're encroaching on someone else's territory. Dan entered the settlement and immediately looked for the tavern. It was closed. The windows were boarded up. The sign hung by a single nail. He asked the blacksmith what had happened. The blacksmith said the owner had died 6 months ago. There were no heirs. The house was for sale for 8 silver coins. Dan counted his money. 12 silver coins and a handful of copper coins. He bought the house. The house was in terrible condition. The roof was leaking in 3 places. The floor on the first level was rotten near the wall. The hearth was caked with soot. The windows had no glass. The staircase to the second floor creaked so loudly it seemed to beg him not to go up. But the hearth was real, large, made of stone, with a wide firebox big enough to fit 3 pots at once. Dan ran his hand over the stone, hot from the sun but cold inside. A dead hearth. He decided that this was the first thing he would bring back to life. He worked non-stop for 3 days. The roof. He found clay by the river. He patched up the holes. Not perfect, but the rain wouldn't get through. The floor. He tore out the rotten planks, replaced them with planks from the shed that stood in the yard. The shed got smaller, the floor got sturdier. The hearth. He scraped out the soot with a knife, rinsed it with water, lit the first fire. The stone warmed up and the house began to smell different. Alive. He covered the windows with oiled cloth. It was a hassle, but it's impossible to cook without windows. Flies, dust, odors from the street. A cook can't work when the wind blows right through the kitchen. He reinforced the staircase with braces. It didn't stop creaking, but it stopped falling apart. On the 4th day, he began to cook. The first soup in the new house. He went to the market. The market in Willowbrook consisted of a single cart that arrived on Wednesdays from Crestville. The cart carried the same produce as everywhere else: poor quality flour, goat butter, salted pork, root vegetables, and grains. But Dan didn't just go to the market. He went into the woods, to the river, out into the fields. On the very first day, he found wild garlic at the edge of the woods. On the second day, river fish. Trout, small but lively, fresh. On the third day, mushrooms, different from the ones in the woods near the pass, lighter in color, firmer, with a creamy aroma. He tasted them raw, safe. The flavor was mild, perfect for broth. On the 4th day, he found wild onions, thin, pungent, growing in whole meadows along the riverbank. Dan picked them and thought that in New York, this onion would cost $20 a bunch. Here, no one takes it. The first guest was a blacksmith. His name was Brand. Broad-shouldered, bearded, hands like 2 ham hocks. He arrived on the 5th day, not for food, just for a chat. He asked why a stranger had bought a defunct tavern. Dan said he was a cook. Brand snorted. He said that in Willowbrook, nobody needed a tavern. People cook at home. Merchants just pass by. Dan asked how his wife was. Brand fell silent. How do you know? Dan said he'd seen dried herbs hanging on a rope by the blacksmith's shop. Coltsfoot, St. John's wort, chamomile. Those are herbs for a sick person. For someone who's been bedridden for a long time. Brand sat down on a bench. He looked weighed down, like a man who's grown weary of carrying a burden. He said his wife had been sick for 3 months. A fever. A healer from Crossvale had come twice. It helps for a week. Then it starts all over again. They're running out of money. Dan asked if he could take a look at her. Brand led him into the house. His wife's name was Merith. Thin, pale. She was lying on the bed under 3 blankets and was still shivering. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was uneven. Dan sat down beside her. He watched. Her skin was dry. Her lips were chapped. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were cold, but her forehead was hot. Heat on the inside, cold on the outside. Her body was fighting against itself. He'd seen this before. Not as a doctor, as a cook. People who eat poorly get sick for a long time. A body without fuel can't fight. A healer treats the symptoms, but if the body is empty inside, the treatment goes nowhere. He asked Brand what she was eating. Brand said porridge. Bread. Sometimes broth. Dan asked what kind of broth. Brand said water with meat and salt. Dan closed his eyes. Water with meat and salt. That's not broth. It's warm, salty water that smells like meat. He told Bran to come by that evening. Bran asked why. Dan said he'd cook something for Merritt. Bran looked at him for a long time, with skepticism, with hope, with that desperate mix of both that people on the brink sometimes have. He nodded and left. Dan returned to the tavern and got to work. Fish, trout. He filleted the whole thing, heads and spines into the pot. Low heat, 40 minutes. Strain it, a clear broth with a deep, fishy flavor. Add ginger to the broth. He had a little left. Garlic, wild garlic, finely chopped. Mushrooms, thinly sliced. Simmer for 10 minutes. Remove them. Put them back in 1 minute before the end to preserve their texture. Wild onions, chop finely, not into the broth, on top of the plate. Raw, for sharpness, for vitamins, for life. Sesame oil, 3 drops, no more. Salt, that very one, bluish, 2 crystals. He stirred it, tasted it, closed his eyes. The broth was just right. Not delicious, not beautiful, just right. He knew it by that feeling that can't be put into words. When a bowl is ready for a specific person, it resonates. Not literally, but in Dan's head, something clicked. Like a tuning fork hitting the right note. He poured the broth into a clay bowl, covered it with a rag, carried it to the blacksmith's house. Merritt was lying there with her eyes closed. Dan asked Bran to lift her head. He brought the bowl to her lips, told her to drink in small sips. Take your time. The first sip. Merritt coughed. The second. She swallowed. The third. The fourth. She opened her eyes. Cloudy. Sore. But open. She looked at the bowl. At the steam. At Dan. She drank half of it and fell asleep. Bran asked if that was all. Dan said he'd come tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and every day until she got back on her feet. Bran asked how much it would cost. Dan said nothing at all. Bran stood there, not knowing what to do with his hands. He spread them out to the sides, then lowered them. He raised them. He rubbed his face. People who are helped for free don't know what to do with their gratitude. It's too big for words and too heavy for silence. Dan cooked for Merritt every day, morning and evening. He varied the menu. The first 3 days, fish broth, light, for an emaciated body that had forgotten how to eat. On the 4th day, he added grains, cooked until creamy. Her body accepted it. On the 6th day, meat, finely chopped, braised until tender, with broth and mushrooms. On the 8th day, Merritt sat up in bed, on her own, without help. Bran stood in the doorway, his beard trembling. On the 10th day, she asked for food, not broth, a proper meal. Dan brought her braised fish with porridge and wild onions. She ate greedily, for the first time in 3 months. On the 14th day, Merritt stood up. She went out onto the porch. She stood there and looked at the sun. Bran stood beside her, supporting her by the arm. With his other hand, he held onto the wall, because his legs were giving way. Not hers, his. Word got around. Not quickly. Willowbrook is a small village. But a small village is a place where everyone knows everything. The blacksmith's wife was back on her feet. A stranger from the abandoned tavern had cured her. Not with magic, food. People didn't believe it. Then they saw Merritt at the market, walking on her own 2 feet. With a rosy glow on her cheeks, they believed it. In the 3rd week, the miller's daughter knocked on the tavern door. 12 years old, skinny, she limped on her left leg. She said her father had sent her to ask if the cook could take a look at her leg. Dan took a look. Not the leg, the hip. The muscle wasn't working properly. Not an injury, underdevelopment. She'd been missing something in her diet since childhood: protein, fat, certain minerals. Her body was growing, but her leg couldn't keep up. He told her it would take a long time. Not just 1 bowl, not just 1 week, months. The girl nodded, serious, mature beyond her years. Dan started cooking for her too. Every day, a separate portion, tailored to her body, for her age, for her leg. There was no money, none at all. 8 silver coins went toward the house. 4 went toward fabric for the windows and materials for repairs. Nothing was left. Bran paid with meat and help with the repairs. The miller paid with flour. Bad flour, but flour nonetheless. Dan took whatever they gave him. He cooked with whatever was available, as always. He named the tavern Komorebi. He wrote the name on a board with charcoal and hung it above the door. Komorebi, a Japanese word. Light filtering through the foliage of trees. No one in Willowbrook knew what it meant, but the word sounded beautiful. And the house stood beneath an old oak tree. And every morning, light filtered through the leaves and fell onto the porch. Dan restored the abandoned tavern in Willowbrook and named it Komorebi. He cured the blacksmith's wife, Merritt, with daily servings of a personalized broth and began treating the miller's lame daughter. Word of the cook who healed with food began to spread throughout the village. In the 6th week in Willowbrook, there was a knock at the tavern door. Dan opened it and saw Yerin. She was standing on the porch. Her cloak was dusty. A bow was slung across her back. A bag hung from her shoulder. Dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. Her lips were pressed together. She was silent. Dan was silent. Then he stepped aside and nodded toward the table. She came in, sat down, placed her hands on the table. Her fingers were trembling, not from the cold. He noticed they were out of ginger. The jar of mushroom paste was empty. Her hands were starting to go numb again. But she hadn't come because of her hands. Dan set a bowl in front of her. Broth, that very one, made with bones, with ginger, with garlic, with mushroom paste, with a few drops of sesame oil, with bluish salt. She took the bowl in both hands, brought it to her lips, the first sip, the second. On the 3rd sip, her shoulders slumped. On the 5th, her chin trembled. On the 7th, a tear trickled down her cheek. She cried and drank the broth, silently, without a sound. Tears fell into the bowl and mixed with the broth. Dan stood at the stove and didn't turn around. He knew there were people who only cried when no one was watching them. She finished her soup. She set the bowl down. She wiped her face with her sleeve, and she said that the squad was falling apart. She spoke briefly, in short, choppy sentences, without details, without complaints. 2 months had passed since Dan left. The first 2 weeks were fine. Fenris did the cooking. It wasn't great, but it was edible. Then the problems started. Gareth began to move more slowly. His joints were acting up again. Fenris was suffering from stomach aches. Lira kept fainting. Alan was losing his focus in battle. Sedric was forgetting spells mid-cast. Not complicated ones, simple ones, basic ones. The ones he'd known since his first year at the academy. They blamed it all on fatigue, on the difficulty of the route, to the bad weather, to demonic energy, to anything. No one said it was because of the food. Because food is just food. They lost 2 battles, not fatally, but they retreated. A hero's squad does not retreat. A hero's squad moves forward. So it is written in the order of the Council of the 5 Kingdoms, and they retreated. Twice. Yerin said she found him on her own, not on orders. Alan doesn't know she's here. Sedric definitely doesn't know. She left at night, left a note saying she'd be back in a week. Dan listened. He nodded. He asked if she'd be staying the night. She said yes. He took her upstairs. The room was small, a bed, a table, a window. Clean. He went downstairs and started cooking dinner. Fish, fresh trout from the river. He filleted it and pan-fried it in a clay skillet with wild garlic and butter. On the side, grain porridge with mushrooms, a bowl of broth, warm bread. He'd learned to bake bread from local flour, poor quality flour. But if you sift it 3 times and add river water and a pinch of blue salt and let the dough rise for 4 hours instead of 2, you end up with bread. Not perfect, but real, with a crispy crust and a soft crumb. Yerin ate in silence. slowly, every bite, every sip, like someone recalling something important. She stayed for 3 days, not just for the night, for 3 days. On the morning of the first day, Dan found her in the dining hall. She was wiping down the tables. He hadn't asked her to. She was just doing it. In the afternoon, she went into the woods and brought back game. Rabbits, quail, once a young deer. She'd been a hunter before she became an archer, you could tell. In the evening, she sat at the table and sharpened her arrowheads. Dan cooked. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. On the morning of the second day, Dan asked how long it had been since she'd slept properly. Yerin looked at him. He said her left eyelid was twitching, a sign of chronic sleep deprivation, and that she was eating too quickly for someone who enjoyed her food. It meant her body was demanding rest, but her mind wouldn't let go. Anxiety. She turned away. She didn't say anything. That evening, Dan prepared a separate dish for her, rice porridge. He'd found a grain similar to rice at the market in Crestville. Not rice, but close. He boiled it down to a porridge, added honey, warm milk, a pinch of something like cinnamon he'd found in the woods. A meal for sleep, for relaxation, so that her body could tell her mind it was okay to let go. Yerin ate it and fell asleep at the table 20 minutes later, her head resting on her hands. Dan covered her with a blanket. She slept for 14 hours. By the morning of the third day, she looked different. Not a different person, the same one, but well-rested. Her eyes were clearer, her shoulders were lower, her lips were slightly softer. She said it was time for her to go. Dan nodded. She walked to the door. She stopped. Without turning around, she said she'd be back. Dan replied that he knew. She left. Dan washed the dishes and went to feed the miller's daughter. The girl's name was Nora. In 6 weeks, she had stopped limping so noticeably. Her leg was still weak, but the muscle had begun work. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter. Every day, Dan prepared a meal for her. In the morning, porridge with bone broth and fat. In the evening, stewed meat with root vegetables, plus a herbal decoction for her joints. Nora came to the tavern every day. She sat down at the table. She ate earnestly, in silence. Then she'd say, "Thank you," and left. Once she asked why he was doing this. Dan said he liked to cook. She looked at him as if he were saying something obviously silly. She said no. Why for free? Dan thought for a second. He said it was because he had nothing else to do. Nora didn't believe him, but she didn't ask any more. By the end of his second month in Willowbrook, Dan realized he had regular guests. Bran came every evening. Not because his wife was sick. Merritt was already walking on her own. She was cooking for herself. But Bran still came. He'd sit down at the table, order a bowl of something, eat, chat, then leave. The miller came on Wednesdays. He brought flour and picked up a portion for Nora. Old Helga from the house on the edge of the village came on Fridays. Her back hurt, and Dan made her a thick broth with bones and pepper. She said that after his broth, she could bend over to the floor. She was lying, but she could bend down to her knees, and before, she couldn't even do that. Merchants started stopping by, not often, once a week. They'd drive through Willowbrook on the road from Crestvale heading south. They'd see smoke coming from the chimney. They'd see the sign. They'd stop in, they'd eat, they'd leave. They'd come back a week later. One merchant from Crestvale named Ormond started stopping by on purpose. He was hauling fabric south and would make a 3-hour detour to have lunch at Komarebi. Dan asked him why. Ormond thought for a long time. He said he couldn't explain it. There are better taverns in Crestvale, more of them, with music and beer. But when he eats here, his lower back pain goes away, and he falls asleep at night without valerian tincture. And in the morning, he doesn't want to drink. Dan nodded. He made Ormond a thick soup with mushrooms and herbs for his liver, because he could see from his face and hands that Ormond's liver was working itself to the bone. The merchant drinks every evening, not out of joy, out of loneliness. Soup doesn't cure loneliness, but it supports the liver, and when he feels better, his head clears up too. Money had appeared. Not much, but it was there. The merchants paid in copper coins, Bran brought meat, the miller brought flour, Helga knitted socks for him. Dan didn't keep track. It was enough for groceries and firewood. He didn't want anything more. One evening, he sat on the porch and looked at the oak tree. Light filtered through the foliage. Komorebi. He thought about his mom, about how she probably wasn't waiting for him on Sundays anymore, about how he never did make the sauce, about how, instead of the sauce, he was making broth for the blacksmith's wife and stewing meat for the lame girl, and that, for some reason, it didn't feel like a substitute. It felt like a continuation. Yerin found Dan in Willowbrook and told him that the hero squad was falling apart without his food. She stayed for 3 days and left with a promise to return. The Komorebi tavern began to attract regulars among the locals and passing merchants. Dan continues to heal Nora and the other villagers with food. Lily appeared on a rainy day. The door opened and a girl stood on the threshold, thin as a stick, soaked to the bone, slightly pointed ears, a half-elf. Her eyes were large, green, frightened. Her hair was plastered to her face. She was wearing a shirt 3 sizes too big and pants tied with a rope. She had nothing on her feet. She stood there in silence. Dan stood behind the counter and said nothing. Then he walked over to the stove. 5 minutes later, he set a bowl in front of her. Hot porridge with honey and warm milk. Bread. A mug of herbal tea. The girl looked at the food, then at Dan, then back at the food. She sat down. She picked up a spoon. Her hands were shaking. The first spoonful. The second. She ate so quickly that she burned her mouth. Dan told her not to rush. The food wasn't going anywhere. She slowed down. She finished eating. She licked the bowl clean. She looked at him and asked if she could mop the floors in exchange for food. Dan asked her name. Lily. He asked how old she was. 17. He asked where her parents were. Her mother had died. She didn't have a father. He asked where she lived. Everywhere. Nowhere. For the past 2 years, she'd been wandering from town to town, washing floors, doing dishes, working for food, leaving when they kicked her out. Dan nodded. He said she could mop the floors, but she'd have to live upstairs. The second room was empty, cold but dry. Lily looked at him as if he'd said he was going to give her a castle. She stayed. The first week, she mopped the floors, wiped down tables, washed dishes, carried water, chopped wood. She did everything she saw, without being asked, without being told, like a creature accustomed to being useful so as not to be driven away. Dan noticed this, and on the 3rd day told her to sit down. She sat down. He said that work started at 6 in the morning and ended at 8 in the evening. There was a 2-hour break between lunch and dinner. Sundays were days off. Lily asked what a day off was. Dan closed his eyes for a second. He opened them. He explained. She looked confused, like someone who'd just been taught the rules of a game they'd never played before. By the 2nd week, Dan started teaching her, not how to cook, just the basics at first, how to hold a knife, how to cut evenly, how to wash vegetables, how to tell if fish is fresh, how to smell flour to see if it's gone rancid. Lily listened as if parched earth were drinking water. She absorbed it. She memorized it. She really did memorize recipes on the first try. Dan showed her how to make broth, just once. He explained the timing, the temperature, the order of the ingredients. The next day, she made it herself. Not perfect, but correct. All the steps were in order. All the proportions were right. Dan tasted it and nodded. He said the broth was authentic. Lily smiled. Her first smile in 2 weeks. Small, timid, like a sprout pushing through a crack in a rock. She told him about her mother in the 3rd week, in the evening after closing. They were sitting by the hearth. Dan was cleaning mushrooms. Lily was folding rags. She spoke without preamble. Her mother was a cook. She worked at a tavern in the port city of Marvin. She cooked from morning until night, every day, no days off. Lily remembered the smell of oil and onions. She remembered her mother's hands, covered in burns and cuts. She remembered how her mother smiled at the guests and cried at night. When Lily was 10, her mother collapsed, right there in the kitchen. Her heart stopped. She'd worked herself to death. 7 years without a break. Her body just gave out. Lily fell silent. Dan stopped cleaning the mushrooms. She said that ever since then, she's been afraid of the kitchen. Afraid that people will leave because of the food. That the kitchen takes away those who stand in it. Dan put down his knife. He looked at her. He said her mother hadn't left because of the kitchen, but because no one had taken care of her the way she'd taken care of everyone else. And that no one in this tavern would work themselves to death, because it's their day off. Because they get a 2-hour break. Because he's a cook who knows how a double shift without a break ends. Lily listened. Her eyes were wet. She didn't cry. She held it in. Dan went back to the mushrooms. Lily went back to the dishcloths. They didn't talk about it anymore. But the next morning, Lily got up at 5, an hour early. She went into the kitchen. Dan was already standing at the stove. She stood next to him. She said she wanted to learn how to cook, not mop floors. Cook, like Mom, but the right way. Dan nodded and handed her a knife. The 4th month in Willowbrook. The Pantry Bee had become a place, not a restaurant, not a tavern in the usual sense. A place where people came. Bran came every evening. Merritt now came with him, healthy, rosy-cheeked. She brought pies. Bad pies, but made with love. Nora came every day after lunch. Her leg had gotten noticeably stronger. She'd started running. Not fast, but running. The miller cried when he saw her. Helga on Fridays, with socks and gossip. Ormond on Wednesdays, with fabrics and stories from Crestvale. A small tavern at the crossroads in a forgotten village. Smoke from the chimney. The smell of food. Light filtering through the oak leaves onto the porch. And the man at the stove who got up at 4 in the morning and knew that Bran had lower back pain on Tuesdays, that Helga's leg cramped during the full moon, that Ormond couldn't have fatty foods because of his liver, and that Nora didn't like fish but ate it because Dan said she had to. He remembered everyone, every body, every detail, and every plate was for a specific person. There was no menu at Komorebi. A guest would walk in, take a seat, Dan would watch. He'd go to the stove, and 20 minutes later, a plate would be set before the guest. Always the right one. Always the one they needed. Once, Lily asked how he knew what to cook. Dan thought for a moment. He said he watched. She asked what he watched. He said everything. At their hands, at their eyes, at the way a person sits, how they breathe, how they hold a spoon. He said that every person tells their story through their body, and you just have to listen. Lily listened. She nodded. She tried to watch the way he did. She couldn't do it. Not yet, but she was trying. Lily, a half-elf orphan, came to the tavern and stayed on as an assistant. Dan began teaching her the basics of cooking, and she showed an exceptional memory for recipes. Lily told him about the death of her mother, a cook, and her fear of the kitchen. The Komorebi became the center of life in Willowbrook, with a growing number of regulars. Adelaide Morven arrived on horseback with 2 saddlebags and a scandal in tow. She walked into Komorebi at noon. Tall, thin, glasses on her nose. Her hair was tied back in a bun from which 3 riding quills stuck out. On her belt hung a bag stuffed with jars and bunches of herbs. She sat down at a table and said she needed hot water, and that if the cook tried to serve her goat butter, she'd set this dump on fire. Dan brought her hot water. She took her own blend of herbs from her bag. She brewed it, she drank it, and looked around. Then she asked if it was true that they prepared food here that healed. Dan said he just cooked. She said that was nonsense. That she was an herbalist and an alchemist. That she'd traveled 60 miles from Crestvale because a merchant named Ormond had told her his liver had stopped hurting after eating the soup. That she knew 213 medicinal herbs and not a single one of them could cure a liver in a single bowl. That she wanted to know what he was putting in the soup, and if it was a banned alchemical ingredient, she was obligated to report it to the guild. Dan listened. When she finished, he asked what was wrong with her right eye. Adelaide fell silent. Her right eye. She blinked it more often than her left. The muscle gets tired. She reads too much in dim light. The lenses in her glasses are different. The right one is thicker. Her vision is deteriorating unevenly. Plus, she rubs her right temple every few minutes. A headache. Chronic. On the right side. Related to her eye and her neck. She'd been sleeping hunched over her books, and her neck was stiff. He told her all this calmly. As a matter of fact. Not as a diagnosis, not as a threat. He simply listed what he saw. Adelaide took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, looked at him differently, without defiance, with curiosity. Asked how he knew. Dan said he was just observing. She said that wasn't an answer. He agreed, went over to the stove. 20 minutes later, he set a bowl in front of her. Broth, but a different kind. Not the one for Yerin, not the one for Merit. Broth for Adelaide. Chicken bones, simmered for a long time. Herbs that relax the muscles. Garlic, ginger, and something new. He'd found it 2 weeks ago in the woods. A dark red root, similar to ginseng, but not ginseng. It had an earthy smell, a bit bitter. He tried it cautiously, in small portions, adding it to his own broth. The effect was strange. Afterward, his head felt clearer, his thoughts faster, his body calmer, as if someone had wiped the window from the inside. He added a pinch to Adelaide's broth. She tasted it and froze. She closed her eyes, opened them, looked into the bowl, then at Dan, asked what kind of root it was. Dan described it. Adelaide reached into her bag, pulled out a notebook, a thick one, worn. She flipped through the pages, found it. Said it was nightstone root, rare. It grows only in the shade of old oak trees. Alchemists use it for tinctures that clear the mind. But the tincture requires 3 days of steeping and costs 20 gold pieces per bottle. And Dan tossed it into the broth and got the same effect in 20 minutes. Dan shrugged. He said that broth isn't a tincture. Broth is a medium. A hot liquid with fat. Fat carries substances better than water, and heat unlocks them. He said it was just physics. Adelaide looked at him. Then she took out a quill, she opened a notebook, and began to take notes. She stayed for a week. A week turned into 2. 2 into a month. She didn't help in the kitchen, she was conducting research. Every day she sat at the table with her notebook and wrote down everything Dan did. Which herbs, what roots, what mushrooms, in what order, at what temperature. She argued with him, every day. He said ginger should be added at the end. She said alchemical theory required adding it at the beginning for complete extraction. He said that full extraction would result in bitterness. She said that bitterness was a byproduct of incorrect proportions. He said that the proportions depended on who you were preparing it for. She fell silent. She thought. She wrote it down. They argued about fermentation. Dan explained the principle. He took the mushrooms, crushed them into a paste, mixed them with salt, left them in a warm place for 3 days. After 3 days, the paste had changed. The aroma was deeper. The flavor was more complex. Adelaide tasted it. She took out a magnifying glass. She examined the paste. She sniffed it. She tasted it again. She said that fermentation alters the resonant structure of the ingredient. Dan asked what a resonant structure was. She explained. In Ehrenfeld, all living things emit vibrations. When 2 vibrations match, an effect is created. Resonance. It's the foundation of all magic in the world. Healers tune the body's resonance. Mages tune the resonance of spells. Blacksmiths tune the resonance of weapons. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he asked about food. Adelaide said that food doesn't count. No one thinks of food in terms of resonance. Food is just fuel, calories, satiety. Dan said it was like treating a violin as just a piece of wood. Adelaide fell silent. She looked at him. Then she said he was either a genius or a madman. Dan said he was a cook. She began to help, not in the kitchen, with the ingredients. She knew every plant within a 20-mile radius. She knew where everything grew, when to harvest it, and what its properties were. Dan would tell her what he needed, and she'd find it. He found wild pepper in the mountains. She explained that it was fire leaf. It stimulates blood flow. He found berries by the river. She said they were tears of the vine. They reduce inflammation. Together, they mapped out the ingredients. Dan described the taste and effect. Adelaide wrote down the alchemical name and resonant properties. 2 languages described the same thing. He said, "It warms you from the inside." She wrote, "Amplifies the resonance of the thermal spectrum in the body's core." He said, "Lifts the heaviness." She wrote, "Neutralizes the negative resonant background." The same thing, in different words. Dan began keeping records seriously, not on scraps of paper, in the notebook Adelaide had given him. A thick one, with a leather cover. He wrote everything down, the guest's name, their condition, what he'd prepared, the effect. A week later, a month later, he was piecing together a picture, slowly, bit by bit, and the picture frightened him. The broth for Merritt didn't just warm her up. It restored her immune system, something the healer hadn't been able to do in 3 months. The porridge for Nora didn't just feed her. It rebuilt the muscle tissue in her leg. The soup for Ormond didn't just help his liver. It regenerated the organ cells. The broth for Yerin didn't just warm her hands. It restored the nerve endings damaged 3 years ago. This isn't just food. And for the first time in his life, Dan didn't know how to react to it. Herbalist and alchemist Adelaide Morven had come to Komorebi to expose Dan, but she stayed after he accurately diagnosed her health issues. Together, they began to develop a body of knowledge by combining Dan's culinary expertise with the science. For the first time, Dan realized that the effects of his food went far beyond ordinary cooking. Sora Kaito came to destroy a reputation, not a person, a reputation. She had heard about Komorebi from merchants on the eastern trade route. Rumors had reached the capital. A cook in the backwoods was preparing food that healed. The rumors annoyed her. Sora had spent 12 years in the royal kitchen. She was the top graduate of the Hinomoto Culinary Guild, a master of the knife, a master of rice, and a fish master. She was fired for refusing to serve the king a dish to which he was allergic. The order was to serve it. She refused. She was told that a chef doesn't make decisions, a chef serves. She left. She wasn't fired. She left on her own. But that didn't change anything. For 2 years, she wandered. She cooked in roadside taverns for a few coins. A master of the royal kitchen frying eggs for farmers. Every day, her pride gnawed at her from within. And then some unknown stranger in the village was supposedly working miracles at the stove. She came to expose the charlatan. She walked into Komorebi in the morning. Dan was standing at the stove. Lily was washing vegetables. Adelaide was sitting at the table with a book. Sora sat down. She said she wanted to watch him cook. Not to eat, to watch. Dan nodded. He was cooking for the morning guests, Bran, Helga, and Nora. 3 servings. 3 different dishes from the same set of ingredients. Sora watched. She saw his hands. A chef's hands are his language. And Dan's hands were speaking. The knife didn't move quickly. It wasn't flashy, but it was precise. Every cut was deliberate. Not a single unnecessary movement. Not a single wasted gram. He peeled the root vegetable, and the skin came off as thin as a hair. All the flesh remained intact. He sliced the onion, and not a single ring was thicker than the next. No ruler, no effort. His hands knew. They'd known for 20 years. Sora watched, and her expression changed. First, skepticism. Then, focus. Then, silence. The kind of silence a master feels when he sees another master. When he sees that the hands across from him speak the same language. She sat there for 3 hours. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She just watched. When Dan finished his morning shift and sat down at the table with a mug of broth, Sora asked where he'd trained. Dan said in New York. She didn't know what that was. He said it was far away. She asked who he studied under. He named his chef. She didn't know him. He shrugged. She asked why he was cooking in the village. With his skills, he could be in any capital city, in any palace. Dan said he liked it here. She didn't believe him. She said a master of his caliber couldn't possibly like it in the countryside. He must want recognition, fame, status. Dan looked at her. He asked if she had wanted recognition when she stood in the royal kitchen. Sora fell silent. He asked if that had made her happy. She didn't answer. He asked if she'd been happy even for a single day in that kitchen. She clenched her fists on the table. Dan stood up. He walked over to the stove. 20 minutes later, he set a bowl in front of her. Miso soup. He'd found beans in the forest that looked like soybeans. He'd fermented them using a method he'd learned from komorebi. It turned out a bit rough. Not real miso, but close. Soup. Rice. He'd learned to cook rice from local grains so that the grains wouldn't stick together. Fish. River trout. Roasted whole. The skin was crispy. The flesh inside was moist. Sora looked at her plate. Miso, rice, fried fish. The breakfast she used to eat every morning at home, in Hinomoto, before she left for the royal kitchen, before she spent 12 years cooking other people's food for strangers. She picked up her chopsticks. Dan had found some thin, straight twigs and whittled them down. Not real chopsticks, but they work. The first piece of fish. She closed her eyes, chewed slowly, swallowed, opened her eyes. They were wet. She said the fish was overcooked by 3 seconds. Dan nodded and said he knew. The local skillet doesn't distribute heat evenly. She said the rice was a little softer than it should be. He said the grain was different. She said the miso was a bit coarse. He said it had been fermented for 4 days when it should have been 4 months. She listed all the flaws, 7 points, and every one of them was right. Dan listened and nodded. When she finished, he said she was right about everything, and that she had a better touch than he did. He stood up, stepped away from the stove, pointed to his spot, told her to show him. Sora stood there looking at the stove, at the hearth, in the komorebi kitchen, small, poor, with earthenware dishes and knives that needed sharpening every day. And she burst into tears. For the first time in 10 years. Not out of hurt, not out of exhaustion, because the man she'd come to expose had given up his spot for her and told her that her hands were better. No one had ever told her that. In the royal kitchen, they told her to shut up and serve. In taverns, they told her to hurry up. Here, they told her to show them. She stayed. They cooked together. 2 chefs, 2 styles. Dan was precision, control, patience, 12-hour broth, porridge simmering on low heat, fermentation lasting days and weeks. Sora was speed, the knife, rhythm. Her hands moved so fast the air whistled. Fish filleted in 30 seconds, vegetables chopped in a minute, perfectly. Together, they covered every aspect of the kitchen. Dan laid the foundation, Sora handled the plating. He simmered the broth, she chopped the side dish. He thought about the guest, she thought about the dish. 2 languages, 1 kitchen. Lily watched them and learned. She soaked it all in. She took notes. Adelaide sat at the table with a notebook, jotting down the names of the ingredients Sora had brought with her. Herbs from Hinomoto, spices, sauces, powders. Adelaide didn't recognize half of them. It both infuriated and delighted her at the same time. Willowbrook was changing. Not quickly, but it was changing. People were getting healthier. Bran stood up straighter. His back, which he'd hunched over the anvil for 20 years, had straightened out. Merritt looked 10 years younger. Nora was running, really running. Helga walked without a cane. Ormond had stopped drinking, not because he'd decided to, but because he'd stopped wanting to. His body had healed, and his mind no longer sought solace in wine. Merchants were traveling to Komarebi on purpose. The road through Willowbrook had become more popular. Money began flowing into the village. The miller expanded his mill. Bran hired an apprentice. A new sign was erected at the crossroads. Willowbrook, Komarebi Tavern. Dan looked at the sign and thought that in New York, this would have taken 10 years and $1 million. Here, 6 months and a single cauldron were enough. The first attack happened at night. Dan was sleeping on the second floor. Lily was in the next room. Sora was downstairs on a bench by the hearth. She slept like a cat, lightly and alertly. The noise woke her first, the creak of a floorboard by the back door. One person. No, two. Sora grabbed a knife. Not a kitchen knife, her own. Short, sharp. The one she used to fillet fish in the royal kitchen. With this knife, you could skin a tuna in a single stroke. It would handle a person just as well. She stood against the wall. The back door opened. A shadow entered. A second followed. Black clothing, hoods, gloves. Professional. Not robbers. Robbers break down doors and shout. These entered in silence. The first took a step toward the stairs. They were following Dan. Sora struck. The knife slashed across the first man's arm. Not deep, but precise. Across the tendon at his wrist. He dropped his weapon. The second man spun around. Quick. Trained. He struck Sora in the shoulder. She flew back against the wall, but she didn't fall. She rolled away. She got back up. There was a crash upstairs. Dan woke up. Lily screamed. Dan bolted out of the room. A third man was standing on the stairs. A third. 3 of them. Sora had seen 2. The third had come around from the front, quietly. While the other 2 were coming through the back entrance, he'd climbed up the wall, through the window. Professionals. Dan stood on the stairs in his underwear, unarmed. In front of him stood a man in black with a short blade. 20 years in the kitchen. Panic didn't have time to set in. His hands acted before his brain. He grabbed the first thing within reach. A frying pan. Cast iron. Heavy. It had been sitting on a shelf by the stairs because it didn't fit in the kitchen. He struck. Not gracefully, not skillfully, just the way you hit with a frying pan. From top to bottom, right at the hand holding the blade. A crunch. The attacker yelped. He stepped back. Dan struck again. To the head. The man fell. Downstairs, Sora was holding 2 of them. One with a slashed arm, the other with his own knife pressed to his throat. She pinned him against the wall and spoke softly, calmly. The way people speak when they know exactly what they'll do if they don't get an answer. Dan went downstairs. Lily was peeking out from behind the door. Pale, shaking, but silent. Not screaming, not crying. Holding it together. Dan told her to stay upstairs. He looked at Sora, at the 2 attackers. The third lay unconscious on the stairs. Sora said the first one was bleeding out. A tendon was deeply severed. If the bleeding wasn't stopped, he'd die. Dan looked at the man. Young, about 25. His face was pale. His lips were blue. There was blood on the floor. He could have let him die. The man had come to kill him. Dan went to get some rags and hot water. He bandaged the wound. He stopped the bleeding. Not because he had forgiven him, because he wasn't the kind of person who let people die on his kitchen floor. In the morning, he interrogated the captive, the one Sora had held at knife point. The attacker didn't want to talk. Dan didn't torture him. He set a bowl of broth in front of him. Hot, simple, unadulterated. Just broth for a hungry man. The captive stared at the bowl, at the steam, at Dan. Then he began to eat. And after eating, he spoke. The Order of Pure Fire, a secret society. They've existed for 300 years. Their goal is the destruction of everything connected to Alien culinary arts. 300 years ago, the great culinary school was burned to the ground. The Order makes sure it never returns. They've detected resonance spikes coming from Willowbrook. Weak but distinctive. The pattern matches records from 300 years ago. Culinary resonance. Someone in this village is doing something that hasn't been done in 300 years. Dan listened. He didn't know what the Alien school was. He didn't know what culinary resonance was. He didn't know that his broth created waves that could be detected hundreds of miles away. But he listened. Adelaide sat beside him and took notes. Her face was pale. She knew about the order. She'd heard the stories. She'd thought they were just legends. Now 3 men in black lay in the basement of Komorebi, and the legend had become reality. The captive told them more. The order wasn't large, but it was influential. They had people at the courts, in the guilds, at the academy. The master of the order is a man named Yerin Valdis, gray-haired, elegant, dangerous. He personally gave the order to destroy the resonance source in Willowbrook. 3 scouts. If they don't return, others will come. More of them, stronger ones. Dan sat at the table, staring at his hands. The hands of a cook. Not a warrior, not a mage. A cook. His hands knew how to chop onions and make broth. His hands had just struck a man on the head with a frying pan. He looked at the skillet, at the dent from the blow. The cast iron was undamaged. A good skillet. His thoughts were racing. The order. 300 years. The school of Alien. Culinary resonance. He had done something that hadn't been done in 300 years, and someone really didn't want that to come back. Adelaide said she needed time. He needed to study the records, find information about the Alien school, about culinary arts as a resonance system. There had to be books somewhere, archives, anything at all. Dan nodded. Then he stood up. He walked over to the stove. He started making breakfast. Bran would be here in an hour, Nora in 2, Helga on Friday. The world might be falling, but people still want to eat. And he's a cook. Sora stood by the wall, wiping a knife. She looked at Dan. She asked if he was afraid. Dan said he was, but breakfast wouldn't cook itself. She nodded. She put the knife away. She stood by the stove next to him. They cooked in silence. Lily came downstairs 10 minutes later, pale but determined. She grabbed an apron. She started washing the vegetables. 3 people in the kitchen, the smell of broth, a fire in the hearth. Behind the wall in the basement, 3 captives. On the horizon, the order of pure fire. And at Komorebi, someone is putting a kettle on the stove. 3 agents of the Order of the Pure Fire attacked the tavern. Dan and Sora repelled the attack. A prisoner told them about a secret society that has been erasing all traces of the Alien Culinary School for 300 years, and that the Order had detected resonance spikes coming from Willowbrook. Dan learned that his cooking creates a magical resonance, and that this makes him a target. Adelaide found the basement a week after the attack. She was searching for information about the Alien School. She combed through her notes, she questioned merchants, she sent 3 letters to the Crestvale Library. The replies came back empty. No records, no books. The Order had wiped everything clean over the past 300 years. But Adelaide was one of those people who never give up. She began searching in person. She went door to door in Willowbrook. She questioned the elderly. Helga remembered that her grandmother had spoken of some old building that used to stand where the tavern is now. A long time ago, before the fire, before the current building was constructed. Adelaide went down into the basement of Komorebi. Dan had never gone down there. The basement was small, dark, damp, stone walls, an earthen floor. Nothing interesting. But Adelaide knelt down and touched the stones. One by one. She tapped them. She listened. After 3 hours, she found it. A slab in the floor. Stone. Square. Made of a different type of stone than the rest of the floor. Older. Much older. She and Dan lifted it together. Beneath the slab lay the foundation. Massive stone blocks laid with a precision found in no other building in Willowbrook. Masonry from another era. A different level of craftsmanship. And there were symbols on the blocks, carved into the stone. Deep. Clear. 3 centuries underground hadn't erased them. Adelaide ran her fingers over the symbols, and her hands trembled. She said they were resonance runes, ancient ones. They hadn't been used for 300 years. She said this Fu Foundation is older than any building in the region. She said they were standing on the ruins of the Alchemy Culinary School. Dan stood in the basement of his tavern, looking at stones that were 300 years old. The tavern he'd bought with his last bit of money because it was on the road and cheap. Standing on the foundation of a school that had been burned down because it was too powerful. A coincidence? Or maybe not. He remembered choosing at the fork in the road. Left to Crestvale. Right to Willowbrook. He turned right. Why? Because the name sounded peaceful. Or because something called out to him. He didn't believe in such things. He believed in broth and the right temperature. But the stones beneath his feet were real, and the symbols were real, and his tavern stood right here. Adelaide worked in the basement every day, deciphering the runes. Slowly, one symbol at a time. The runes described principles, not recipes, principles. The resonance between the body and food, the alignment of vibrations, the precision of the balance. She translated one symbol as, "Remember the one for whom you are cooking." Another as, "Listen to the body before feeding it." A third as, "One plate, one person." Dan read the translations and felt a chill run down his spine. These were his principles, the ones no one had taught him, the ones he'd developed on his own over 20 years in the kitchen. Word for word. The ancient school of Alchemy taught what he'd known since birth. Or perhaps he knew what it taught. There was no difference. The result was the same. He stood in the cellar, looking at the runes, and realized that he was no ordinary cook from another world. He was the answer to a question asked 300 years ago. Princess Isolde Wainhart arrived 3 days after the cellar was discovered. She didn't know about the cellar. She didn't know about the school. She came because she was hungry. And because, for the second time in her life, she had run away from the palace. She entered the tavern wearing a hooded cloak. A single bodyguard followed her, silent, professional. He sat down by the door and ordered a beer. Dan looked at the girl in the cloak. 23 years old. Her posture was straight. Too straight. That's how people stand who were taught to keep their backs straight from the age of 3. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves. Her skin was pale. Not from illness, from being indoors. This girl never sees the sun. Her eyes were gray, tired, and angry. Angry not at anyone in particular, at everything. Dan asked what she wanted. She froze. She looked at him. No one had ever asked her that. Her whole life she'd been told what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat. Breakfast by the book, lunch by schedule, dinner by etiquette. Not a single dish she'd chosen herself in 23 years. And now a man in an apron at the stove asks what she'd like. She didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth, closed it. She sat there for 40 minutes. Dan didn't rush her. He waited. He wiped down the counter. He talked to Lily about how the turnips at the market were better than usual this time. After 40 minutes, she said one word. A warm one. Dan nodded. He went back to the stove. Rice porridge. That grain that looks like rice. Simmered until it had a creamy consistency. Stewed apple. He'd found wild apples in the forest across the river. Small, sour. But if you simmered them in honey over low heat for 2 hours, they became soft and sweet and smelled like childhood. Cinnamon. That forest spice. A bit. Warm milk at the bottom of the bowl. Blue salt. 2 crystals. He set the bowl in front of her. She picked up a spoon. The first sip. She closed her eyes. The second. Her hands relaxed. Her shoulders dropped. That wall she'd been holding up for 23 years cracked. It didn't collapse. It cracked. A small crack, through which warmth seeped in. She finished eating. In silence. She stood up. She placed a gold coin on the table. She left. A gold coin. Dan held it in the palm of his hand. That's how much a month's rent for a nice house in Crestville costs. for a bowl of porridge. He put the coin in a drawer and thought that the girl in the coat would return. He knew it. Just as he knew when the broth was ready. Not by the clock, just a feeling. She came back a week later, and a week after that, and again. Every time in a raincoat. Every time with a bodyguard at the door. Every time in silence. And every time Dan set a plate in front of her. A different one, but always warm. Because she'd asked for it warm. And he remembered. Adelaide discovered the foundation of the ancient Aelion culinary school in the tavern's basement, with runes describing the very same principles that Dan had used intuitively. Princess Isolde Wainhart began secretly visiting the tavern and became a regular. Dan realized that his arrival in this world and his choice of the tavern were no coincidence. Kaede Noctis came to kill Dan on Thursday. She had received a contract from the Order of Pure Fire 2 weeks earlier. Target: a chef in Willowbrook. Creating forbidden resonance. Eliminate quietly. Leave no traces. Payment: 50 gold pieces. Kaede was the best at her job, a half-blood from Hinomoto, 28 years old. She remembered 22 of them, not the first 6. She was taken from her home when she was 6. Who? Why? She doesn't remember. She only remembers the smell of food, something hot and meaty. Her mother was cooking when they came for her. For 22 years, she'd dreamt of that smell. And she hated it because it meant the end of home, the end of safety, the end of everything that was warm. She walked into Komorebi 2 hours before closing time, a gray raincoat, a hood. She ordered tea. She sat by the window. She studied her target. The man behind the counter. 28 years old, of average height, average build, the hands of a cook, no threat. There were 3 ways to kill him: poison in his own food, a knife at night, or a noose when he went out in the morning to fetch water. She would have chosen poison, clean, quiet, professional. But first, she needed to figure out the schedule. Who lived in the house? How many people? Is there security? She sat and watched. Dan looked at her. One glance was enough. His coat was clean, but mended. His boots were good, expensive, but worn unevenly. His left foot stepped more softly, a habit of moving silently. His hands were gloved, but her fingers were slender, quick. When she lifted the cup, her index finger rested not on the handle, but beneath the bottom. That's how you hold throwing knives. Her neck. Where the coat parted, the edge of a scar was visible, an old one, a thin one, a professional scar. Not from combat, from training. This person had been cut to teach them how to dodge. Dan saw all of this, and he saw something else. Dark circles under her eyes, not from lack of sleep, from exhaustion. She hadn't been eating much, for a long time. Her body was thin, too thin for someone who earned a living through physical labor. She ate to stay alive, not to live. He went to the stove. Kaede watched. 10 minutes later, he approached her table. He set down a plate. Onigiri, 3 rice balls. He'd shaped them from local grain. Inside was fish, trout, salted, finely chopped, wrapped in a sheet that looked like seaweed. Next to them was a cup of green tea, not the one she'd ordered, but another kind. He'd brewed it himself from herbs he'd found in the mountains. The taste was clean, slightly bitter, with an aftertaste of fresh grass. Kaede stared at the plate. She hadn't ordered this. She'd ordered tea. Plain tea. But in front of her were 3 rice balls with fish and tea that smelled different. Dan said she reminded him of a girl, a waitress from a place where he used to work. She too worked 2 shifts without a break. And she too forgot to eat. And she too had eyes like that. Kaede looked at him. He turned and walked back to the counter. She looked at the onigiri. Rice balls. Food from Hinomoto. She hadn't eaten anything like this since she was 6. Since that day when the smell of meat filled the air, her mother was standing at the stove and the door opened. She picked up an onigiri, took a bite. Rice. Warm. Soft. The fish inside was salty and tender. The nori on the outside was crispy. The taste was simple, honest, ancient, the taste of a home she no longer has. She ate, and tears streamed down her face, silently, without a sound. That's how people cry who've forgotten how to cry and suddenly remembered. She ate all three. She drank some tea. She stood up. She went out. Dan washed her cup. That night, Kaede sat on the roof of the house across the street and looked at the tavern. Smoke from the chimney, warm light in the windows. She took out the contract, a parchment bearing the order's seal. 50 gold pieces for the chef's head. She tore the parchment, slowly, into pieces. In the morning, she walked into Komorebi and said she was staying. She could be paid in food. Dan nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask where she was from. He just nodded. The way he nodded when a new person sat down at his table. Lily gave her an apron, white, with a kitten embroidered on it. Lily embroidered in the evenings, poorly but diligently. Kaede put the apron on over her black clothes. She looked at the kitten. She didn't say anything. She washed dishes, carried water, chopped wood. At night, she'd disappear. She'd return around dawn. No one asked where she was going. Dan knew, or at least guessed. It had become safer around Willowbrook. The wolves were gone. The highwaymen had vanished. Merchants stopped losing their goods. The shadow guarded the tavern. And no one knew about it. 6 women. Yerin came once every 2 weeks. She stayed for a day or two. She left. She returned. Lily was there every day. Adelaide every day. Sora every day. Isolde once a week. Kaede every day. And every morning, Dan would get up at 4, he'd light the fire, and he'd cook 6 breakfasts, 6 different ones, for 6 different people whom he remembered. The assassin Kaede Noctis came to kill Dan on a contract from the Order, but after tasting his onigiri, she tore up the contract and stayed at the tavern. All 6 heroines are now connected to Komorebi. Kaede secretly protects the tavern and the surrounding area from threats. Every morning, Dan prepares 6 personalized breakfasts. The heroes' party arrived in Willowbrook at the end of winter, a year and a half after Dan's exile. They looked like people who had lost the war but hadn't yet admitted it. Alan walked in front. He'd lost weight. His cheekbones were prominent. His hair was dull. The gold was gone. Only the yellow remained. His armor was dented in 4 places and hadn't been repaired. That meant either no money or no strength. His eyes were dull, not dead, just dull, like a fire that still smolders but no longer gives off heat. Behind him was Gareth. He was limping, his left knee. His shield was on his back instead of in his hand. That meant his arm couldn't hold it. Fenris. His right shoulder is 2 fingers lower than his left. The injury Dan had noticed a year ago had gotten worse. A spear in his left hand. Lira. Dan didn't recognize her at first. She'd aged 10 years in a year and a half. Her skin was gray. Her eyes were sunken. Her hands weren't bandaged. They just hung limply. She had worn herself out. Healing had drained everything from her and given nothing back. Sedric walked last. His back was straight. His face was haughty. But Dan saw it. A tremor in his right hand. Barely noticeable. A mage with a tremor in his hand is like a violinist with a dislocated finger. He can play, but not the right notes. 5 of them. There used to be 6. Yerin isn't here. She's already here, standing behind the Komorebi bar, polishing glasses. Alan walked into the tavern and stopped in the doorway. He looked at Dan. Dan was standing at the stove, an apron, a knife in his hand, steam rising from the pot. A year and 6 months. That's how long it had been since the day Alan handed him a pouch of silver and said it wasn't his decision. Alan opened his mouth. He closed it. Opened it again. He couldn't bring himself to start. His eyes were wet. 24 years old. No, 25. His birthday had come and gone while he was on the road, probably without any celebration. Dan put down the knife. He picked up a ladle. He poured soup into a bowl. He set it on the table. He nodded toward a chair. Alan sat down. He picked up a spoon. The first sip. He closed his eyes and his face broke. He didn't cry, he just broke, like a man who'd held it in for a year and a half and finally let it go. Gareth sat down next to him, silently. Fenris next to him. Lira next to him. Dan placed a bowl in front of each of them. 4 different dishes. He'd only seen them for 30 seconds, but that was enough. Gareth got a thick broth with cartilage. Fenris got soft porridge. Lira got a double portion with honey and berries. Alan got meat soup with fat and grains. They ate in silence. A reconciliation without words. Because words weren't needed. The soup said it all. Sedric entered last. He stood by the door. He watched. The tavern, the people at the table, Dan. His face was unreadable. Then he sat down on the edge of a bench, far from the others. Dan set a bowl in front of him, a regular portion, but with those very same dark grains, nightstone root, for clarity of mind, for the tremor. Sedric looked into the bowl, then at Dan, and something like understanding flashed in his eyes. He ate in silence. They were still there, all 5 of them. The tavern wasn't designed to accommodate so many people, but Willowbrook helped out. Bran set aside a room above the blacksmith shop for Gareth and Fenris. The miller let Alan stay with him. Lira lived in the temple. Sedric rented a corner from Helga. Every day they came to the Komorebi to eat, and every day Dan watched them recover. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter. Gareth's knee, Fenris's shoulder, Lira. She needed it most of all. Dan cooked for her 3 times a day. In the morning, porridge with honey and butter. At noon, broth with bones and herbs to help her recover. In the evening, warm milk with nightstone root and spices to help her sleep. After a week, her cheeks had regained their color. After 2 weeks, she raised her hand and healed Lily's cut finger. And she cried because she thought she would never be able to. Alan trained every day in the clearing beyond the village. With a sword. Alone. For hours. Dan would bring him lunch to the clearing, set it on a rock, then leave. Alan would eat and continue training. After a month, the gold returned to his hair. After 2 months, his strikes resonated again. The paladin was waking up. Sedric didn't speak to Dan. He ate, he nodded, he left. But the tremor subsided after 3 weeks, and one evening he walked up to the bar and said one sentence. He said he'd been wrong. Dan poured him some tea. Sedric drank it. He left. They never discussed the past again. News arrived 6 weeks later. Merchants from the east brought word. The Order of the Pure Fire was gathering its forces. Magister Yerin Valdis was personally leading the expedition. 30 battle mages, 50 soldiers, 2 archmages, heading for Willowbrook. They're coming to destroy the tavern, to destroy the very foundation of the School of Aelion, to destroy Dan, and everyone with him. Dan stood on the porch and looked east. Nothing on the horizon, just fields, a forest, the sky. But somewhere out there, 80 people were marching toward his home, toward his kitchen, toward his people. He sighed, went back inside, began counting his supplies. The hero's squad arrived in Willowbrook exhausted and battered. Dan welcomed them without a word and began to restore their strength through food. Sedric admitted his mistake. After 6 weeks of recovery, news arrived that the Order of Pure Fire, led by Magister Yerin Valdis, was marching toward Willowbrook with an army of 20 men. Dan cooked for 6 hours. He started at dawn. He finished when the sun was at its zenith. 12 plates, 12 people. Alan, Gareth, Fenris, Lira, Sedric, Yerin, Sora, Adelaide, Isolde, Kaide, Bran, Nora. 12. Each plate was unique, each for a specific body, a specific soul, a specific wound. He cooked in silence. Sora stood nearby and helped with the chopping. Lily tended the fire. Adelaide passed the ingredients. The Komorebi kitchen functioned as a single organism. 4 people, 2 chefs, 1 herbalist, 1 girl who remembered every recipe on the first try. For Alan, meat broth, thick as the earth's blood. Beef bones, 12 hours of simmering. He started last night. Herbs of strength, fiery leaf for blood. Blue salt, 4 crystals instead of the usual 2. Bread, fresh, made from flour that Dan ground himself on a stone. Heavy, dense, each slice like a brick of energy. For Gareth. Aspic. Dan simmered it for 2 days. Cartilage, tendons, bones. Everything that's in the body and everything missing from Gareth's body. The aspic has set. It trembles on the plate. Solid, transparent, with garlic and pepper. For Fenris. Porridge, soft as a cloud. The grains boiled down to a creamy consistency. Honey, butter, berries, nightstone root for the nerves. For the shoulder that's been aching for 3 years. For the hands that used to tremble but no longer do. For Lira. Soup made from everything life has to offer. Fish, meat, mushrooms, herbs, every ingredient for healing. A triple portion. With honey, with vine tears for inflammation, with milk. Lira had been empty for 1.5 years. Today she must be full. For Sedric, clear broth, transparent, not a single unnecessary note. Nightstone root, double dose. For clarity, for precision, for formulas that must not blur on the 3rd syllable. For Yerin, that very same broth, the first one, made with bones, with ginger, with garlic, with mushroom paste, with sesame oil, with blue salt. The one that brought her fingers back to life, but stronger, deeper, more precise. Every ingredient was selected after 1 year of experimentation. Every proportion was fine-tuned through dozens of attempts. This broth is perfect. For Sora. Miso soup, the real thing. 4 months of fermentation. Rice, perfect. Fish, pan-seared to perfection. Not a single 3 seconds longer. Dan remembered. Breakfast with Hinomoto. Home. The beginning. Roots. For Adelaide. A strong decoction. Bitter, complex. 8 herbs. Nightstone root, fireleaf, tears of the vine, and 5 more she wrote about in her little book. Her own recipe. Dan remembered it and made it better than she did herself. 40 solde. Rice porridge with simmered apple and cinnamon. Warm, simple, the very one. The first one. Because she asked for something warm and he remembers. For Kaede. Onigiri with fish and green tea. Because that's the taste of home. Because she'd forgotten it, and he reminded her. Because every time she eats onigiri, her hands stop clenching into fists. For Bran. Meat stew. Thick. Simple. Honest. Just like Bran himself. With garlic for high blood pressure. With pepper for his lower back. With fat for a heart that's been pounding away at the anvil for 30 years. For Nora. 12 years old. She's no fighter, but she's part of Willowbrook, and Dan won't leave her without a plate on the day everything is decided. Porridge with meat and bone broth. For the leg that now runs. For the girl who grew up at his table. 12 plates were carried out of the tavern. They were set on a long table in the middle of the clearing in front of Willowbrook. Bran had whacked the table together overnight, out of planks, crooked, rough, but sturdy. 12 people sat down at the table, facing east, from where the Order's army was coming. They ate, in silence, each with their own plate, each with their own taste, their own smell, their own warmth. Alan ate and felt the light rising within him from his stomach to his chest. A paladin. A light that had gone out a year and a half ago. A light that had smoldered and waited. Now it flared up. Not from prayer, from broth cooked by a man who remembered every battle he'd fought and every weakness he'd had. Yerin ate and her fingers tingled. Not numbness, the opposite. Hypersensitivity. Every finger sensed the wind, its direction, its strength, its moisture. She could have shot with her eyes closed. Sora ate and her hands sang. There is no other word for it. Her muscles vibrated. The knife at her belt rang softly, resonating with her body. A speed she'd never possessed before waited at her fingertips. Kaede ate, and the shadow beneath her feet began to stir. The shadow, her gift, her curse. A technique that had been drilled into her for 22 years and that had never fully obeyed her. Now the shadow lay flat, obediently, for the first time in her entire life. Isolde ate, and the family sword on her lap hummed, quietly. The Wainheart sword. 5 generations. It had never responded to her before. Now it had. Lira ate, and the light in her palms flared, brighter than ever, brighter than in her best days. Sedric ate, and the spells formed before his eyes. Clear, crystal clear. Not a single blur, not a single tremor. Every spell was perfect. Gareth ate, and his knee stopped aching, for the first time in a year. The shield fit into his hand like an extension of his body. Fenris ate, and his right shoulder snapped back into place. He raised his right hand. Gripped the spear, no pain. Bran ate, and his hands grew heavier, the fists of a blacksmith, with which he had been forging for 30 years. Now every blow would be like a hammer. The 12 men finished eating. They rose from the table, and the air trembled. The resonance of 12 bodies tuned to perfect harmony struck out in a wave. The grass lay flat. The leaves on the oak tree fluttered. The clouds over Willowbrook parted. Dust appeared on the horizon. The Order's army, 80 men, 2 archmages. Master Aaron Valdez on a white horse led the way. They saw 12 people seated at a table in the clearing. Valdez reined in his horse, gray-haired, straight back, the face of a university professor. Cold eyes. He was looking at the table, at the plates, at the man in an apron standing behind the 12, clearing away the dishes. And Valdez understood, not his head, his gut, that ancient feeling he had suppressed for 40 years. The smell of food, the smell of broth, the smell of a hearth, the smell of home. He gripped the reins and gave the order to attack. The battle of the feast began. Yerin raised her bow. An arrow settled on the string. She drew it back. She released it. The arrow flew and split in midair, into 7. 7 arrows found 7 targets. 7 soldiers of the Order fell. The Order's archmage screamed. He unleashed a barrage of fire onto the clearing. Sedric stepped forward. 1 word. 1 spell. Shield. The fire splashed against him like water against a wall. Sedric stood there, not even trembling. Kaede vanished. She dissolved into the shadows. She reappeared 10 meters away, among the soldiers. 2 strikes. 3. 4. Shadows danced around her as if alive. Soldiers fell without seeing where death was coming from. Sora entered the fray with 2 daggers. Her hands moved so fast it was impossible to follow. The blades flashed like silver threads. Every strike was precise. Every movement was economical. A dance of steel. Alan raised his sword. Light burst from it in a pillar. The paladin strode through the ranks of soldiers, and with every swing he purified the world. Like dawn. Like the first ray after night. Gareth stood with his shield facing the enemy, and nothing got through. Not a blade, not a spell, not a charge. The shield rang out and held firm. Fenris struck with his spear, with his right hand, without pain, without fear, every blow like thunder. Lyra stood behind him, and light poured from her in a stream, healing on the fly. The wound on Gareth's arm closed in a second. The cut on Fenris's cheek vanished. She didn't tire. For the first time in a year and a half, she didn't tire. Bran entered the fray with a hammer, a blacksmith, not a warrior. But his blows bent armor like paper. Isolde raised the family sword. It sang in her hands. She had never learned to fight, but the sword knew. 5 generations of Wainhearts guided her hand. She slashed and wept at the same time. The Order's second archmage struck. A dark wave, forbidden magic. Adelaide stepped forward, unarmed, with a book in one hand and a vial in the other. She threw the vial. The liquid flared in the air. Neutralization. Alchemy against magic. The dark wave dissipated. The archmage stared at her, his mouth agape. She adjusted her glasses and pulled out a second vial. The battle lasted an hour, 80 against 12, and the 12 were winning. Because 12 plates had made 12 ordinary people into something greater. Not gods, not heroes, themselves. The best versions of themselves. Valdis dismounted. He walked across the battlefield, toward the tavern, toward Dan. Dan was standing on the porch of Komorebi, wearing an apron, unarmed. Valdis stopped in front of him. 2 former chefs, standing face to face each other. Valdis said that Dan didn't understand what he was doing, that cooking was a weakness, an attachment, a love that makes one vulnerable. His mother was making soup when the killers came. She could have run, but she didn't abandon the pot. She didn't abandon those for whom she was cooking. And she died. Love killed her. Dan listened. Then he said that Valdis's mother didn't die of love. She died at the hands of those who came to kill her, and that the difference between them was that Valdis blamed the soup, while Dan blamed the killers. Valdis stood there in silence. His hand, holding the blade, trembled. Dan turned toward the door. He went into the tavern. A minute later, he came out with a bowl. Soup, plain, made with bones, with herbs, hot. He set it on the porch railing. He said that if Valdis wanted to remember why his mother had stayed at the stove, the soup was on the porch. Valdis looked at the bowl, at the steam. The blade in his hand was lowering, slowly. Centimeter by centimeter. He didn't take the soup, but he didn't strike either. He turned around. He walked away. His army had been defeated. His archmages lay on the ground. His soldiers were fleeing. He was leaving alone. And halfway across the field, he stopped. He turned around. He looked at the tavern, at the smoke from the chimney, at the bowl on the porch, and he kept walking. The morning after the battle, the field in front of Willowbrook was still smoldering. The smell of scorched earth and wet soil hung in the air. The grass was trampled. The table on which 12 plates had stood had split in half. One leg jutted upward like a broken finger. Bran stood nearby, scratching his beard. He said he'd knock together a new one, a sturdier one. Dan stood on the porch of the Komorebi. He watched. He counted the wounds. He counted the people. He counted those still on their feet. Yerin's cheek was torn. Her bandage was soaked with blood. She stood by the fence, holding a bow in her left hand. With her right, she touched the bandage. Her fingers moved perfectly. Not a trace of numbness, not a second's delay. An hour ago, those fingers had split an arrow into 7, and each had found its mark. Now they were carefully adjusting the bandage. Lily was sitting on the steps. Her left arm was bandaged from wrist to elbow. She hadn't been fighting, but when a burning arrow fell onto the roof of Komorebi, she climbed up to put it out. Without thinking, without asking. She climbed up because it was her home. Her first real home in 7 years. She couldn't let it burn down. She fell from the roof. She got burned. She didn't cry. She put out the fire. She walked down the stairs with singed hair and a calm expression. Lily Ashford, 17 years old, an orphan, a chef's apprentice. She put out the fire with one hand. Sora stood against the tavern wall, her back to the stone, her arms hanging at her sides, her eyes closed. She breathed slowly and evenly. The knife was put away. The second knife. Not that one. The one she'd had for 12 years. The one she used to fillet fish for the royal table, with which she could skin a salmon in a single motion. It had broken in battle. The blade had found a gap in the armor of a soldier of the order. It went in, and snapped against a rib. She kept the shard in her pocket and said nothing. But Dan saw her touch her pocket every few minutes, checking, like someone who touches a wound to make sure it's real. Adelaide was sitting on a barrel by the entrance. Her glasses were broken. The left lens was cracked diagonally. The right one had fallen out and been lost somewhere on the battlefield. She was squinting and writing something down in a notebook. Even now, even with just one lens, even after she'd neutralized the Archmage's spell with a vial of an alchemical concoction that, in theory, didn't exist. She'd synthesized it last night while the others slept. From herbs, from mushrooms, from blue salt, from everything she'd learned over the months at Komorebi. The habit of writing was stronger than the pain, stronger than fatigue, stronger than her broken glasses. Isolde stood a little apart from the others. Her cloak was torn. Blood stained the fabric. Someone else's or her own? It was impossible to tell. The Wainhart family sword sat in its sheath at her belt. It had fallen silent after the battle. It had stopped vibrating. It had stopped humming. But it had responded. For the first time in 5 generations, the sword, which had been passed down from father to son, had responded to a daughter. The third princess, who had been groomed her entire life for a political marriage and who had never chosen anything for herself, she chose to take her place in the ranks. She chose to fight, and the sword acknowledged her choice. Kaede was limping, her left leg. A spear thrust in the final minutes of the battle. A soldier of the order had struck her in the thigh when she materialized from the shadows. A split second too early. Just 1 second. She killed him an instant after the blow, but her leg hurt. She didn't show it. She stood by the oak tree and pretended she was just leaning against the trunk. Over her black battle garb, she wore an apron, white, with a kitten embroidered on it, a gift from Lily. She hadn't taken it off before the battle. She'd forgotten. Or maybe she hadn't. Alan was kneeling in the middle of the field. His sword was stuck in the ground in front of him. The hilt jutted upward. The golden pommel had lost its luster. His head was bowed. He wasn't praying. He was just standing there like that. A paladin boy, 25 years old. The end of the world resting on his shoulders. And a year and a half ago, he had driven out the only person who had held his squad together. Because he was afraid of losing his authority. Because he was 24. And didn't know that authority isn't about everyone obeying you. It's about making the right decision even when it seems wrong. He realized that. Too late, but he realized it. Dan looked them all over. Every face, every wound, every detail. A torn cheek, a burned hand, a broken knife, shattered glasses, blood on a coat, a limping leg, a boy on his knees. He saw them the same way he saw the guests in the restaurant, not as a crowd, but as individuals, each with their own story, their own pain, their own plate. Then he sighed, turned toward the door, and said calmly, in that same voice he'd used for 20 years in the Komorebi kitchen after a 12-hour shift, when his legs were buzzing, his back was aching, and his eyes were heavy, but there was still cleaning to do and preparations for the next day ahead. Calmly, steadily, as if stating a fact. All right, everyone to the table. I'm making breakfast. He walked into the tavern. Smoke rose above the roof of Komorebi. Not from a fire, from the hearth. The very same hearth he had brought back to life on the first day. Stone, wide, with a firebox big enough for 3 pots. The fire caught right away, as if it had been waiting. It smelled of rice, onions, simmering meat. Lily followed him in, silently. She stood at the sink. She began washing the vegetables, with her left hand. Her right hand was bandaged, but her left hand worked, and the vegetables weren't going to wash themselves. Sora came in. She stood at the cutting board. She picked up the second knife, the spare one, the one that was worse. Shorter, dull. The balance wasn't quite right, but it cut. She began slicing the onion. Even rings, all the same, even with a bad knife. Her hands remembered. Adelaide walked in, without her glasses, squinting. She bumped into the corner of the table. She cursed. She asked where the ginger was. Dan said it was on the second shelf. She said the second shelf was empty. He said it was in the bag by the door. She found it. She sniffed it. She nodded. She set it down next to the cutting board. 4 women in the kitchen. No, 3 women and 1 girl who was becoming a woman faster than any of them. A fire in the hearth, water in the pot, a knife on the cutting board. Work. Familiar. Proper. The kind that requires no heroic feat. It requires only getting up and doing it. 20 minutes later, the table was set. Not out in the field, inside. In the Komorebi dining hall. Small, cramped, with a ceiling that Bran had repaired twice and that still creaked whenever someone walked upstairs. Everyone came in, one by one, in pairs, silently. It was heavy, like people who've done something enormous and don't realize it yet. Yerin entered first, as always, quietly, without a word. She sat down in her seat, by the window, to the left of the counter. She'd sat here from the very first day she arrived and cried over the broth. The seat hadn't changed. The person had changed. The seat hadn't. Lily was already inside. She took off her apron, put on another one, a clean one, without cooking stains. Her special occasion apron. She had 2 of them, a work apron and this one. Dan didn't know she considered the second apron a special occasion one. She never said so, but she only wore it on special days. Sora sat down at the table. She placed her hands on the wood. She looked at them. Hands covered in small cuts from the knife fight. Hands that, an hour ago, had moved faster than the eye could follow. Now they lay quietly on the table. Tired. Like tools that had done their job and were waiting for the next one. Adelaide sat down next to Sora, without a book for the first time in several months. The book was in her pocket, but not on the table. Now was not the time to take notes. Now was the time to eat. Isolde walked in and sat down. Her hood was thrown back. Her face was uncovered. She wasn't hiding. Princess Isolde Wainhart, the 3rd daughter of the King of Silverland. At this table in a small tavern in a forgotten village. Without a crown. No protocol. No schedule. At a table where a plate awaited her, one prepared just for her because they remembered she liked her food warm. Kaede was the last of the women to enter, limping, but as soon as she stepped inside, she shed her limp like a mask. She straightened up. She walked to the corner. Her corner. She always sat in the corner, with her back to the wall, facing the door. A professional habit. But now the door was just a door, not an escape route. Alan walked in and stopped. He looked at the room, at the people, at the plates, at Dan behind the counter. His eyes were red. He'd been crying on the field, alone, with no witnesses, or so he thought. Kaede had seen it, but she wouldn't say anything. He sat down, heavily, the way a 25-year-old man sits who carries the weight of a 40-year-old. Gareth sat down next to Alan, shoulder to shoulder, silent support, a silent shield, just like in battle. Fenris sat down. He twirled his spoon nervously, a habit, just as he used to twirl his spear. But a spoon isn't a spear. A spoon is for eating. Lira walked in, and the light in the room grew a little brighter, or so it seemed. She sat down. Her hands lay on the table, palms up. Open, empty, ready. Sedric entered and sat at the end of the table, as always, slightly to the side, but not far, closer than before. Bran entered and filled a quarter of the room with his presence, Merith under his arm, healthy, rosy-cheeked. The very same Merith who, a year ago, couldn't get out of bed. She brought a pie. A bad pie. Lopsided, burnt on one side, but made with so much love that it almost glowed. Nora ran in, on both feet, steady, fast. The miller was right behind her. He looked at his daughter, and tears streamed down his face. Every time she ran. It had been half a year already. He still cried. Helga came in with a stick. She didn't need the stick, but she carried it out of habit, and for authority. Ormond sat in the corner across from Kaede, pale, still. He'd spent the night in the cellar, the first fight of his life. More precisely, his first fight behind the wall. He'd heard everything, the smell of burning, the screams, and the silence afterward. He hadn't slept, but he came to the table, because Dan's soup helps with everything, even fear. 20 people at the table, 20, in a room meant for 10. It was cramped, elbows bumping, different kinds of chairs, benches, stools, a single barrel turned on its side. Improvisation, just like life at Komorebi. Dan brought out the plates, one for each person, as always, just like every day, the only way he knew how. Not the same for everyone, separately for each person. Yerin received her broth, that very one, the first one, made with bones, with ginger, with garlic, with mushroom paste, with sesame oil, with blue salt. The aroma rose from the bowl, and she closed her eyes for a second. Just 1 second. Then she opened them and began to drink. Slowly, in small sips, just as he'd taught her on the first day. Lily received sweet pancakes with berry syrup and a glass of milk. Because she's 17. Because she loves sweets. Because she put out a fire with one hand and deserved every drop of syrup. Sora got miso soup, rice, fried fish, breakfast with hinomoto. Home. Morning. Her mother at the stove. That morning before she left and became a stranger in a strange kitchen. Now she has her own. Adelaide got a strong broth. Bitter. Complex. Scrambled eggs with herbs and toast. She always used to read while eating. Now there's nothing to read. The book is in her pocket. No glasses. She ate and stared straight ahead. And for the first time in a long time, she simply ate. Without analyzing. Without taking notes. She just ate. Isolde got warm porridge with stewed apple and cinnamon. That very one. The first one. She asked for it warm, and he remembers. He'll always remember. Kaede was served onigiri with fish and green tea. 3 rice balls. Just like the first time, the taste of home that isn't there, or that is there now. Here, at this table, in this corner, with this apron featuring a kitten over her black clothes. Alan was served meat soup, thick, hot, with fat and grains, fuel for a body that burns twice as much as it thinks. He ate, and the color returned to his face. Gold slowly flowed back into his hair, or so it seemed. Gareth got broth with cartilage. He silently gave a thumbs up, just like on the first day. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Fenris was given porridge, soft, delicate, for a stomach that had been tormented for 3 years. He ate, and his right shoulder didn't hurt. He moved the spoon with his right hand, not his left, his right. Lira was given a triple portion, with honey, with berries, with butter, with warmth. She ate, and the light in the hall grew brighter. It wasn't just an illusion. It was happening. Quietly, gently, like dawn. Sedric was served clear broth with dark grains, nightstone root, for clarity, for precision, for a mage who had forgotten what it meant to see the world without a fog in his head. Bran was served stew, thick, simple, honest. Merritt sat beside him and slipped him pieces of bread. He ate and didn't notice. She smiled. Nora received porridge with meat and bone broth. For a leg that runs, for a body that's growing, for a girl who had become as integral a part of Komorebi as its walls and hearth. Helga received broth with pepper for her back. Ormund got mushroom soup for his liver and nerves. The miller got a stew with bread and the feeling that his daughter was healthy and that the world wasn't as bad as it had seemed last night in the cellar. They ate. The silence of the first few minutes gave way to sounds. Spoons against bowls. Swallows. Sighs. Then words. Bran said they needed a new table, a bigger one, for everyone. Nora said that Lily's pancakes tasted better than Dan's. Lily blushed all the way to the tips of her pointed ears. Dan looked at Nora, at Lily, and nodded. He said Nora was right. Lily blushed even more. Ormund spilled soup on his knees. He jumped up, swore, sat back down. Nora laughed. Fenris laughed after her. Bran laughed after him. Laughter rippled across the table like a wave. Not loud, weary, but genuine. Marith was wiping Bran's beard with a napkin. He waved her away. She kept going. Gareth silently handed Lily a rag for the milk she'd spilled. Sora and Adelaide were arguing. About mushrooms, about fermentation, about which strain was best for long-term aging. Sora said shiitake. Adelaide said far underwood root mushrooms. Sedric looked up from his plate and said that the magical structure of root mushroom spores was unstable at temperatures above 60 degrees, and that if Adelaide wanted to ferment them, she'd need a cold environment. Both women fell silent. They looked at him, then at each other. Adelaide opened her mouth, closed it, took out a notebook, began to take notes. Sora snorted. Sedric went back to his broth. His ears were red. Alan ate and smiled. For the first time in a year and a half. Not a faint shadow of a smile, a real one. From the soup, from the warmth, from the people around him. From the fact that he was sitting at the table and no one was expecting him to make decisions. No one was waiting for orders. No one was expecting him to save the world right now. Right now, all they expected of him was that he finish his meal and pass the bread to Gareth. Isolde ate with her hood thrown back. A princess at a communal table. No formalities, no servants, no schedule. She ate warm porridge, the apple melted on her tongue, and the cinnamon warmed her throat. And sitting nearby were people who knew who she was and who didn't care. To them, she was a girl who liked warm food, and that was enough. Kaede ate onigiri, and her face gave nothing away, the face of an assassin. A mask. But under the apron with the mask didn't stay on as well, especially when Lily approached and silently placed a second cup of tea next to her, simply because the first one had gone cold. Kaede looked at the tea, at Lily. She said nothing, but she accepted it. Dan stood by the stove and watched them. His tavern, the people at the table, at 20 plates, each for a specific person, each with a specific flavor, a specific warmth, a specific story. He thought about his mom, about how she used to stand in the kitchen of their small apartment and make him breakfast before school. Scrambled eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice, every morning, 15 years in a row. She never asked if he wanted to eat. She just set the plate down. Because breakfast isn't a question. Breakfast is a fact. He thought about the sauce, about the promise he'd made but hadn't kept. About how Sunday had passed. And the next one. And the next. And Mom had probably stopped waiting. Or maybe she hadn't. He didn't know. He closed his eyes. And he heard. Not with his ears. With something else. With what had always been inside him. With what had helped him at Komorebi since when the broth was ready without a timer. With what told him that the guest at the fourth table needed meat, not fish, even though he'd ordered fish. With that feeling that had no name on earth. Here it had a name. Resonance. 20 bodies at the table. 20 vibrations. Each body resonated. He could hear it. He heard it consciously for the first time. Before, he had sensed it. Now he heard it. Bran sounded like a low rumble, heavy, steady, an anvil. Nora sounded like a stream, fast, ringing, alive. Yerin sounded like a taut bowstring, a high-pitched note, precise, pure. Lily sounded like a bell, delicate, timid, but pure. Sorta sounded like a blade striking stone, sharp, swift. Adelaide sounded like the scratch of a pen on paper, fast, persistent. Isolde sounded like a fire in the hearth, warm, hidden. Kaede sounded like silence, not empty, full, the kind of silence that comes before dawn. Alan sounded like dawn, light, gold, hope. They all had their own sound, and together it was music. Not in unison, no. Each had their own note, but together, like an orchestra, like a choir, like a kitchen on a busy Saturday morning when everything is in its place and everything is running smoothly and every plate goes out on time and you're standing in the middle of that flow, smiling because this is the moment you get up at 4 in the morning for. He opened his eyes. He looked down. His hands were glowing. Warm golden light. Not bright, not blinding, like embers in a hearth, like light filtering through foliage. Komorebi. Adelaide was the first to see it. She dropped her spoon. The spoon clattered against the bowl. The room fell silent. Everyone was looking at Dan, at his hands, at the light. Adelaide stood up, slowly. She wasn't wearing her glasses, but she could see. It was impossible not to see. She said quietly that it was the Master's resonance, that he was last seen 300 years ago by the founder of the Aelion school, that this meant the chef's body had tuned into perfect resonance with every person for whom he was cooking. All at once. 20 resonances, 20 notes, one melody, one pair of hands. The hall fell silent. Dan looked at his hands, the chef's hands, with burns, with cuts, with calluses from the knife. Hands that had spent 20 years chopping onions, kneading dough, and setting plates before people. These hands were glowing. He raised his palms upward. Light rose toward the ceiling. Soft, alive, warm. The floor beneath his feet vibrated. Quietly, deeply. The runes in the basement. The foundation of the school of Aelion. Stone blocks 300 years old, symbols carved by the last master. They rang out. They responded. They recognized it. 300 years of waiting. A single request cast into the fire by the last master on the night the Order burned everything he loved. A request not for revenge, not for power, not for rebirth. A simple request, like a good broth. Send the one who remembers, the one who knows, the one who gets up at 4 in the morning, not for glory, but so that by 6 there's a plate on the table. The request waited. It waited 300 years. It traveled through worlds. It found a point of intersection. A truck's headlights, 3 o'clock in the morning, a crosswalk, a thought of mom's sauce. And a chef from New York opened his eyes on the shoulder of a dirt road in a world where the sky is too blue and the grass smells of mint and iron. Dan stood in his tavern, wearing an apron, with glowing hands, a chef from another world. And he knew what to do next. Not to kill the Demon King. That's Alan's job. Alan will handle it. He's a paladin. His light has returned. His body has been restored. His spirit is whole. And behind him is a squad that has become a squad again. Not to defeat the Order. The Order has been defeated. Valdis is gone. Maybe he'll come back. Maybe not. The soup was sitting on the porch. It had gone cold, but it was still there, like an open door you can walk through when you're ready. Not to become a hero. He's not a hero. He never was. He never wanted to be. He's a cook. He knew he had to do what he'd been doing his whole life. Get up in the morning, light the fire, make broth, feed people, and teach others to do the same. Because he's alone, and the world is big. And in this world, there are millions of people who don't know what real broth is, who are sick and don't get better because they're fed water with meat and salt, who are growing weaker because no one cooks for them, personally, with care, with a memory of who they are. The Alien School will be reborn, not tomorrow, not in a month, slowly as dough rises, as slowly as broth simmers, as slowly as Merit recovered, as slowly as Nora's leg grew stronger, as slowly as Yerin learned to trust, as slowly as Lily stopped being afraid of the kitchen, just as slowly as Sora remembered why she became a chef. Lily will be the first student. She memorizes recipes on the first try, but it will take her years to learn to see people through food, to learn to hear the resonance, for her hands to glow. Maybe they'll never glow. That's okay. Not every chef is a master, but every chef can make an honest broth, and an honest broth is already a lot. Sora will be a master of the knife, a master of presentation, a master of speed and precision. Adelaide will be the guardian of knowledge, the chronicler, the one who will record everything, every recipe, every ingredient, every principle, so that in 300 years we won't have to wait for a chef from another world, so that knowledge lives on. A new school, a new hearth, a new fire on old foundations. Dan lowered his hands. The light went out. Gently, like embers dying down. But the warmth remained. In the walls, in the stone, in the people, in the air, in the scent of rice and onions and slow-cooked meat. He turned toward the table. Everyone was looking at him. 20 pairs of eyes, waiting for something great. A speech, an announcement, a revelation. He could have spoken about the school, about the master, about the request that had been waiting 300 years, about destiny and resonance, and about how his hands had just been glowing. But he didn't. He looked at the table and saw that Ormond's bowl was empty. He said he'd bring a second helping right away. Ormond beamed. Bran slapped his hand on the table and said he wanted some too. Nora raised her hand. Me too. Marith nudged Bran with her elbow and said he'd had enough. Bran put on a hurt expression. Nora laughed. Lily followed her. Then Fenris. Laughter rippled around the table. Dan turned toward the stove. He poured a second helping. Carried it out. Set it down. Came back. Poured some more. Carried it out. Work. Ordinary. Every day. The kind that never ends. The kind that is the meaning of it all. An ordinary morning. Breakfast. People at the table. Smoke from the chimney. The smell of food. Light filtering through the oak leaves on the porch. Somewhere far off on the horizon stood the black citadel of the demonic king. The seals held. But they were weakening. 2 years. Half a year left. Alan will finish his soup. He'll get up. He'll take his sword. And he'll go do what he was born to do. His squad will go with him. Restored. Whole. Strong. Every body is in tune. Every resonance is in place. And in each person's backpack will be a bundle of food, prepared personally, for each one individually. Signed by Lily because Dan's handwriting is as illegible as a chicken's. And Dan will stay. At the stove. With a ladle. Wearing an apron. And he'll cook. For everyone who walks through his door, for the sick, for the weary, for the broken, for those who've forgotten what home smells like, for those who never knew. Because he's a cook, and he doesn't just cook food, he cooks for people. Late at night, when everyone had gone home and the tavern was empty, the dishes were washed, the floor was mopped, and the fire was dying down, Dan sat alone. On a chair by the fire, legs stretched out, hands on his knees. They didn't glow. Ordinary hands, with burns and cuts. Silence. The embers crackled. Night outside the window. Stars. The moon. Willowbrook was asleep. He closed his eyes and thought of his mom, of her hands, of how she used to stroke his head as he fell asleep, of the smell of her kitchen, of how he hadn't said goodbye to her, he hadn't hugged her, he hadn't given her the sauce. He'd left for his shift and never came back. He sat in silence and thought about it, and he didn't cry, because tears don't change what happened. But if someone had looked in the window, they would have seen that the hands of the man in the chair were trembling slightly. And far away, very far away, in another world, in another time. In a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on the outskirts of town, a woman was sleeping. She was dreaming of her son. He was standing in the kitchen, not her kitchen, another one, an unfamiliar one, with a stone hearth and clay dishes, wearing an apron, holding a ladle. People were gathered around him, lots of people. They were eating. They were smiling. He stood among them and his hands were moving, with practiced ease, precisely, quickly. He was cooking, and he turned toward her. In her dream, he looked at her and smiled and said, "Mom, I'm running late, but I'm cooking. You'd be proud." She woke up. 3 in the morning, darkness, silence, tears on the pillow, a smile on her face. She pressed her hand to her chest, to the place where her heart beats, and she knew. Not with her mind, not with logic, with that very feeling that has no name in any world. A mother's feeling. Her son is alive. He's far away, so far away it's immeasurable, but he's alive. He's feeding people, and that sauce he promised, he makes it every day, for everyone who sits down at his table. Not that sauce, a different one. Better, more, warmer. She lay back down, closed her eyes, and fell asleep peacefully. For the first time since that Sunday when he didn't come. In Willowbrook, a fire burned in the hearth. Smoke rose toward the sky. The moon hung over the roof of Komarebi. The stars were reflected in the creek behind the village. Quiet, peaceful. It smelled of coals, of cooled rice, of the night air, and just a hint of that elusive scent that lingers after 20 people have eaten their dinner and gone home satisfied. The scent of a full table. The scent of empty plates. The scent of home. Dan Reed was sleeping by the hearth, and he dreamed he was home. And he was home.